I'm really excited to be here. Oh, there we go. So I'm really excited to be here. My name is Robin Succi. I work at the Active Minds National Office in Washington, D.C. I'm our chapter manager, so I work with our 600 plus Active Minds chapters around the country at high schools and colleges, which is about 15,000 students each year, which is awesome. And in that work, I've really been able to see a whole host of student leaders doing really cool and innovative and exciting things. But the chapter here at APUS has always kind of been on the cutting edge in a lot of ways. They were one of our first online only schools and has actually really helped students all over the country be able to adjust to the current conditions of the pandemic and virtual learning and help us guide them in getting active minds programming and mental health programming kind of going effectively at this time where the conversations are needed more than ever. So I'm really excited to be here just to open things up to introduce our presenter. I do have just a couple housekeeping notes for folks. So we are recording via Zoom and on YouTube. So it'll be streamed there and then held there afterwards. There are moderators in the chat in Zoom and on YouTube for questions as they come up. And there'll be time for Q&A throughout and at the end of presentations. And just a note that because we are talking about some pretty intense topics with mental health, just a general kind of content warning if you're in a spot where you need to take a break, or if you need to sign off for a few minutes and come back, that's totally fine. I think presenters will kind of be sharing more about their topics as we go through. But just a note there. Just looking over my notes. Yeah, so I think that's all I was supposed to say. Ree will tell me otherwise. Like I said, I'm really excited to have been able to pop in and support y'all. I feel like I have to mention that Dr. Ratliff, who is the chapter advisor and presenting later on today, is actually Active Minds Advisor of the Year this year. So among a very elite few folks who have been able to get that designation again out of over 600 chapters. So worth mentioning that, worth mentioning the great work that y'all have done. And I think with that, I'll throw it over to Miss Jennifer Ellis, who's going to talk about suicide and correctional facilities.
So just one quick, one sec, Robin, if you could just give us like a 1-2 minute brief of the survivor panel real quick.
Oh yeah,
as well. Thank
you. Really exciting. So this afternoon, there are several folks, from what I understand, coming by to talk about surviving suicide in different ways. So surviving suicide attempts, being a survivor of a friend or family member's suicide. There's a lot of great work going on right now about, reducing stigma around, intervening in suicide or having conversations with your friends or family if you're worried about them. But a population that's sometimes forgotten are folks who who have lost someone to suicide. Active Minds story, if you will, I'll give the brief version. Our founder, Allison Malman, was a first-year student at the University of Pennsylvania when her brother Brian, who was a senior at Columbia, died by suicide. And it turned out that he'd been struggling quite a lot in his academic year, hadn't really told anyone he did try to seek help, it wasn't very effective. And Allison speaks about how, she returned to college for her sophomore year, and her friends really wanted to be there for her, but didn't know how to do that, didn't know how to have a conversation about suicide or kind of sit with her in that grief very particular to that loss. So she founded Active Minds as a way to not only prevent suicide, but also provide space for people to feel comfortable talking about suicide from a survivor's perspective. So she and her family have really led that conversation over the past 16 years, I think. And it's great to see that kind of population represented here.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Yeah. Thank you so much, Robin. All right, Miss Jen, I'm going to go ahead and share your presentation now. So whenever we get to the point where you need to switch screens, can you see it there? Can everyone see the new screen?
I'm going to speak on behalf of the crowd and say yes.
Miss Jen, you're unmuted. Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Great. I was asking you if you could hear me.
I'm not able to pull up, I don't know why, my PowerPoint, so I'm just going to work from what I can see on the screen with you, because
Okay.
I can't pull mine up.
Okay. We'll make it work. Just let me know whenever I need to switch screens. And if I don't, if I can't tell the video's coming, just let me know. Go ahead and play the video.
I'm not even going to know when the video's coming because I can't see it.
I bet you we work it out though. Okay. Either way, go ahead and get started, and I'll see if I can find a way. The only problem is everyone else will see what's coming up next too. So if you're okay with that, I don't mind doing it.
Actually, I'm okay with that. Yeah,
okay.
I'm okay with that. Yeah, we can do that.
Let me go ahead and make that adjustment real quick.
Hopefully it won't distract them too much.
They'll be okay. Let's see. Let me just pull it back up. I'm going to mute myself so you don't hear me talking to myself. 1 second. How's this? Is this okay with you, Jen?
I still see what I did see before. It hasn't changed for me.
Now that's weird. Okay.
Yeah. I'm just not sure what's going on with my screen. It's very weird. And
it's okay.
I can't see you.
It's okay. We'll take 1 minute. At the very top of your computer, very top left by the apple, does it say PowerPoint or Zoom, or what does it say?
Finder.
Okay. So that's our problem. So click escape or move your mouse around. So
the escape button is doing nothing.
Okay, so if you take your mouse and scroll it around to wherever you can find your PowerPoint. I know you have a Mac, but I don't know where you have.
Well, and I'm clicking on opening the PowerPoint, it just won't open. Okay, now I see a full screen of my PowerPoint and I can't see anything else.
Hey, but that's better than nothing, right? So if you, does it now say PowerPoint in the upper left-hand corner next to the apple?
No, it says nothing. It says nothing, and I can't see any controls. I can't see PowerPoint, Finder, Zoom, nothing.
So now if you hit escape, it should minimize your PowerPoint.
There's no escape. It took my escape button away, and it has end show.
On your keyboard?
Yeah. Oh, I think I did escape though. Okay, now I see PowerPoint.
There we go. Okay, so up on PowerPoint, click on slideshow.
There's no slideshow option up there anymore. It's just not, it's gone. It changed for some reason, and there's no slideshow option. I can't control it.
Okay, so is there anyone on the line that is better at tech stuff than me that can help me walk Miss Ellers how to see what she needs to see? Is there anyone? I'm gonna let you all unmute yourselves.
I mean, you guys, you can't see my screen now, can you?
No, I just, because we need to get you started, we need you to at least be able to see Zoom so you can see what I'm presenting or see your own PowerPoint.
Okay. Let's go with Zoom. I'd like to be able, I'm gonna close my PowerPoint here, and now I can see Zoom.
Okay.
Oh no. Ree, are you still there?
I'm here.
Now I can't see Zoom anymore.
Okay, here's what I'm gonna do. I'm gonna pause recording for technical difficulties.
All right, hello everyone. Sorry for the technical difficulties, but I'm really glad to be here presenting for you today. And I wanna just give a little bit of background first and say thank you so much for letting me present on this really important topic. It's actually a relatively new topic for me. I've been speaking a lot on suicide in the last decade, but I just started a new position with an organization that places chaplains in prisons and jails throughout the world. on June 1st. So the topic of suicide in correctional facilities is relatively new for me. And to be honest, it wasn't until I started this new position and began doing some research that I realized what a huge problem this is. So kind of the breakdown, and you can move forward on the slide, Ree, that I'm going to do for kind of give you an overview of what we're going to cover here is I am going to first give you some general information on suicide rates and sort of the crisis that we're facing in the US with regard to suicide. Many of you listening probably already know that, and you may have covered some of that, but I just want to kind of review it so we have a comparison. Then I'm going to start to talk about what the data says about suicide in correctional facilities and what a crisis it really is. And then we'll talk about a national study of jail suicide and gives us some insight into some of the details, specifics of what is going on with regard to suicide. And then we'll look at some implications of that study for prevention and change. And then I briefly want to mention trauma in the incarcerated. Trauma is one of my specialty areas of speaking, and I've worked with people experiencing all kinds of trauma for the last 20 years. And again, it wasn't until I looked at taking this position that I realized what a huge issue trauma is for justice-involved individuals. And we really have to address that simultaneously to deal with the issue of suicide. So that's where we're going to go today. And I know we don't have much time, so I'll kind of be moving quickly through this, but hopefully we'll have time at the end for questions if there's something that you need me to cover more in depth. But we can go to the next slide now. I want to start with some information because we also had some questions about these things. To just start with some definitions so that people understand when we're talking about suicide, that a suicide completion is a death caused by self-directed injurious behavior with an intent to die as a result of that behavior. So we're talking about completed suicides. Things that are ruled as suicide mean people intended to take their own life in whatever they were doing. A suicide attempt is a non-fatal, self-directed, potentially injurious behavior with an intent to die as a result of the behavior. It may or may not result in injury of any type, but the intention of that person was to take their own life. Suicidal ideation is simply thinking about, considering, or planning suicide. We can move to the next slide. I wanted to address the issue of non-suicidal self-injury, so I'll talk a little bit more about that, but this is a desire to create an injury to yourself, to him or herself, but without the intention of taking your life. Cutting is the most common form of non-suicidal self-injury, and a lot of people don't know how do those two relate. How does suicide relate to non-suicidal self-injury? People that are cutting, and there are some other forms of self-injury, but cutting is the most common, are not intending to take their own life. It is an expression of a lot of emotional pain going on. So it can correlate with mental illness, but it really is a sign that that person is in great pain, and the cutting is an attempt to cope with the emotional pain and to sort of stabilize them emotionally. A lot of people express it and have expressed it to me as I feel a sense of relief of my pain when I make the cut. And it can be complicated for people to understand, but it really is a form of coping with emotional pain. And one young woman that I worked with said, it's a way of giving outward expression on my body to the pain that I'm feeling inside, and that helps release it. It's a form of expressing that. However, it's really important to know that in a lot of the research about suicide, non-suicidal self-injury can acclimate a person to self-injury in such a way as to increase their risk of completed suicide if their issue isn't addressed. So while the cutting itself is not a desire to take their own life, should their emotional pain get to and escalate to the point where they want to take their own life, a history and pattern of cutting can make that easier. I also want to mention that in this context because we have a huge problem with non-suicidal self-injury in the incarcerated population. And so a lot of times, though, the education for the people dealing with justice-involved individuals, they don't know the difference between non-suicidal self-injury and a suicide attempt, or even how those two could correlate in the long term. That it's not someone trying to kill themselves, but it is a cry for help and a sign that there is an increased risk, perhaps, of suicide down the line. Can we move to the next slide now? I want to start with some statistics, just so it gives you a real life picture of the suicide crisis in our nation in general. The CDC is running about 2 to 3 years behind in their suicide data. I do have the 2018 data. Some of this is from the years leading up to that. I expect we might have a delay going forward for the next couple of years, even in getting suicide data from 2 years past. The reason I say that is, well, the CDC kind of has their hands full with some other stuff right now. So I'm not sure that we'll be getting the 2019 numbers, and we won't really get a full picture in terms of data of what 2020 looks like, probably until maybe 2022, if then. But we're starting to see some numbers trickle in, and it's not good news. But in 2000, we've seen a huge rise in suicide, or what I would say a steady, slow but steady rise up since around 2008. Before that, numbers of suicide in our nation would go up and down. But in 2008, they started rising steadily. The mental health community and the suicide prevention community responded by an active campaign for education and prevention. Just about everybody involved in mental health or suicide prevention has had really focused efforts. But in spite of those focused efforts to try to reduce those numbers, they've continued to climb, and these numbers give you a picture of that. 41,149 people took their lives in 2013. That was up to 42,773 in 14, 44,193 in 15, 44,965 in 16, 47,173 in 17. It's the 10th leading cause of death in the US. And this was just an interesting number of when that number sort of surpassed a significant number. In 2015, there were more than twice as many suicides as homicides. We hear a lot about homicide, and we didn't prior to that, at least in the general media, hear as much about suicide. Let's move to the next slide and look at what happened in 2018. 48,344 people took their lives in 2018. So still climbing up. But what I like to say to people is, yep, we haven't turned it around yet. We're not seeing those numbers decline, but imagine what those numbers would be if we hadn't been making a focused effort. So I think we are making a difference. We just haven't turned it around and aren't taking it in the other direction yet. There were 1.4 million documented suicide attempts in 2018. I want to make a point that those are documented attempts because the true number of attempts are far higher than that number reflects. These are only people whose attempt had them injured in such a serious way, or the results were such that they ended up in medical treatment or medical care where it got documented that it was a suicide attempt. I can't tell you how many people I encounter that have a plan and an attempt for suicide, but they don't get seriously injured. They take pills and then throw up and just wake up the next day and go, well, that didn't work, but they didn't have to go to the hospital. So it doesn't get documented. I worked with a young man recently who told me of his attempt to take his own life by train. And we have a big problem. I'm in the Chicago metro area of people standing on the train tracks to take their own life. It's a horrible situation. We're trying to put up protective barriers and things like this, but this young man had been planning for months. He knew exactly what time the train came through and when, so he planned his suicide on a day and at a time went and stood on the tracks, and the train didn't come. It didn't come. It didn't come. And after an hour, he just gave up and went home. And something had delayed the train. There was a problem on the tracks and the train got rerouted. So whether you want to call that fate or God, his suicide plan thankfully got interrupted. And he is still alive and, by the way, doing great today. But people like him don't get in that number. So there are a lot of suicide attempts that don't get reported in that number. Men die by suicide 3.56 times more often than women. However, many of you might know that women attempt more often. It's just men often use more lethal means and do die by suicide at a significantly higher rate. The rate of suicide is the highest in middle-aged white males. Traditionally, it was, and for many years, older white males in the senior population, but the middle age in the last 10 to 15 years has kind of surpassed that, and it's middle-aged males 45 to 65 in that age range. They're the highest rate. Firearms in the United States at least accounted for just over half of all suicide deaths. And on average, there are 132 suicides per day. So we do have a significant suicide problem in our country. Let's move on to the next slide. So how does that compare to what's going on in our correctional facilities? Again, thank you for tuning in to listen to this important information, because what I found even in my own life, but also in general, the incarcerated are a population that we don't think much about unless we are directly connected to someone who's incarcerated. Either you or someone you know works in a correctional facility, or your life has been touched by incarceration, and that somebody that you know, care about, love, maybe even yourself, has spent time incarcerated. So, but I want to make more people aware of what's going on in our correctional facilities. According to the National Institute of Corrections, suicide is a threat to all persons involved in corrections in any aspect. Inmate suicide rates are far higher than national averages. So we just looked at what the national problem is. It's even a more significant problem in this population. It's higher still for some special populations within correctional facilities, and that includes our juveniles. So our young people are at an even higher risk. And corrections officers have a much greater than average occupational risk for suicide. That's how I first became aware of a problem in corrections long before I took my current position. I had in one of my classes, I teach crisis intervention classes and suicide classes. I had a really incredible man and a colleague of his from California State Corrections come to one of my crisis intervention classes. He came because, and you'll get to hear from him a little bit later in this presentation, a colleague of his killed himself. And he knew they had to do something. They started peer support. He got a lot of training, but he was the one that made me aware of the much higher rates. I knew that they're really, the profile there for post-traumatic stress disorder and suicide rates look a lot like those of law enforcement or even military. So they have a high occupational suicide rate. Let's move on. Next slide. Suicide is the leading cause of death in jails. That was from a study the years between 2000 and 2016. But it's a worldwide problem, not just in the US. Rates are increasing across the globe. Let's go to the next slide. Suicide rates, and this was a question we got beforehand, are significantly higher in jails than in prisons. We're going to unpack the why of that because it makes a lot of sense when you start looking at the data. And again, these numbers are from a study that was done from between 2000 and 2016. By the way, 2016 is the last year that I have numbers for correctional facilities. But the jail suicide rate is 46 per 100,000. The prison suicide rate is 16 per 100,000, and the general suicide rate in the US is about 14.5. So that gives you a comparison per capita of the suicide risk. And it really is, it is higher in prisons than the general population, but in jails, it's really through the roof. Let's move to the next slide now. I mentioned this globally, so I just want to say I don't know if we would have anybody internationally or connected internationally, but this is going on throughout the world in correctional facilities. Studies in England and Wales have reported significantly higher incidence of suicide since 1999. Rates among males globally are 5 to 6 times higher than the general population. In females, 20 times higher than the general population. So I have a couple of, let's go to a couple of graphics here that kind of give you a visual image. This is suicide in jails versus prisons. The green there is the US rate in our prison system, and then the red is the jail suicide rate per 100,000, so significantly higher. And then there's one more graphic, we'll go to the next slide, that talks about the different cause of death in jails. At the bottom, and I don't know if you can see that really well, we have drug and alcohol abuse is that sort of line that's higher than the other two at the bottom. We have cancer and liver disease down sort of as causes of death. The big one just under the top, which is, by the way, that top yellow line, in case you can't see it, is the suicide as cause of death. It is the #1 cause of death in jails. But the one just below that is heart disease. And so we know that a lot of complicating factors for all of these are high in our incarcerated population and cause of death, but suicide is by far the #1. So I'm going to show you a video now that is from an Associated Press story. It did not get wide release. Some of you may have seen a story like this, but I didn't, about the crisis in our jails of suicide.
Surveillance footage shows an inmate return repeatedly to a closet unlocked by a guard. On his next visit, he hangs himself. Devin Lynch, a Marine reservist, died at the Cook County Jail in 2016. His family sued the county and in April received a $1.7 million settlement. Lynch's death highlights a disturbing trend. Inmate suicides have become a growing problem in many U.S. jails as more mentally ill and drug-addicted people land behind bars.
This problem has never been as bad as it is today. Jails across the country are being sued. People with mental illness are dying on an almost daily basis.
Jail suicides hit a high of 50 deaths for every 100,000 inmates in 2014, the latest year of government data. The Associated Press and the University of Maryland's Capital News Service examined hundreds of lawsuits involving allegations of mistreatment and the suicide of mentally ill inmates at local jails over the past 5 years. In case after case, jails are accused of refusing inmates medication, ignoring cries for help, imposing harsh conditions, and failing to monitor inmates who might harm themselves.
She had so much more to live for and so much left to do.
Melanie Zumadakis' daughter suffered from mental illness. Tana Jo Fillmore was arrested in November 2016 for violating probation in a drug case. Her family says while in jail, she was denied her prescription medications despite repeated pleas and threats of suicide. On the 9th day, she hanged herself with a bedsheet. The Duchesne County Sheriff declined to discuss the case due to a pending lawsuit.
I want to see change in these jails. I don't want any other parent to do this.
This has a special moment.
In Dane Schickman's case, a son lost his mother. Elizabeth Gaunt, who had a history of mental illness and substance abuse, was acting erratically when she was taken to the Lake County Jail in Northern California in 2015. The 56-year-old former social worker was placed in a sobering cell with a surveillance camera, and she was supposed to be checked every 15 minutes.
She begged multiple times over the course of hours for a medical doctor, for help, and no one in the jail had the humanity to step up or lift a finger to help her.
After 25 hours, she tore a blanket into strips and took her own life. The county settled a wrongful death lawsuit for $2 million.
I don't want to see anybody die under my watch, whether it's somebody that's in custody, whether it's a member of our community. Like I said, I take my obligation, and then my employees take their obligation to make sure that people come in here and they're safe when they're here.
After Gaunt's death, the jail installed larger surveillance monitors, replaced blankets with tear-resistant ones, increased suicide prevention training for staff, and added a registered nurse, among other reforms. John Snook of the Treatment Advocacy Center applauds jailers for taking action, but calls it a Band-Aid on a gaping wound.
So the reality, if you want to fix a jail, build more hospital beds.
We'll never give up the fight.
With fewer psychiatric hospitals left in the country, any solutions come too late for parents like Melanie Zumadakis. Terry Che, Associated Press.
That is just heartbreaking. And I'm sure, well, I don't know, maybe it's not as startling to you. It was startling to me when I first began to do this research and hear these stories. I really didn't know what was going on. And I think a lot of our population doesn't know that. And here I'm a therapist, a mental health professional, and I wasn't aware of the significant problem of mental illness and suicide in our jails. Let's move to the next slide. Again, we do have this national study of jail suicide absolutely shows our highest risk in jails versus prisons. The specific study that I'm going to cover now was done in 2005 and 2006, and they looked at 696 jail suicides and analyzed the data on 464 of those. So that's where these numbers come from. But it gives us a lot of really important information and insight into what's going on. Let's go to the next slide. These are just some of the characteristics from that particular study. 67% were white, 93% of those who died by suicide in this study were male. Correlates pretty highly with the statistics we looked at from our population in general, white men being the biggest risk. The average age here was 35, so a little bit lower than our national average, but still correlates really strongly with some of that information that we looked at for the general population. 42% were single, but here are the significant numbers, at least for me, that give us information. 47% had a history of substance abuse, 28% had a history of medical problems, 38% had a history of mental illness, 20% had a history of taking a psychotropic medication, and 34% had a history of suicidal behavior. It was pretty clear from this data going in, they already had a high risk factor associated. Let's move to the next slide. The deaths were evenly distributed throughout the year, so there wasn't a particular season of the year when more of those happened, pretty evenly distributed. 32% of them occurred between 3:01 p.m. and 9 p.m., so the late afternoon, evening hours were a high risk. 23% occurred within the first 24 hours of entering the facility. 27% between day 2 and 14, and 20% between 1 and 4 months. It's really clear from this data and all the data that first 90-day window when someone is incarcerated is a huge risk factor. And by the way, that's certainly one of the theories, and I think an obvious reason why jail suicide is so much higher. For those who might not know, a lot of people are in jails as they're awaiting trial, awaiting sentencing. This is where people go to start. Now, some people only end up in jail and then they're released. Some people then, though, after a trial are sentenced and they go to a prison. But it's that adjustment period when their life has changed, when the reality is hitting them that they are at the greatest suicide risk. I think this data gives important information in terms of prevention. Let's move to the next slide. 93% of victims in the study used hanging as a method. By far, across the board, in all correctional facilities, the number one method of suicide is hanging. Because obviously we have restricted some of the access to other lethal means, that's still the number one by far. 66% of people used bedding as their instrument, so ripping apart bed sheets or blankets to hang themselves. 30% used a bed or a bunk as an anchoring device. But by the way, they were really creative. There are a lot of different things that could be used as anchoring devices. And as I've heard some of the stories from our chaplains, it's shocking how creative these people can be. They've obviously been thinking about suicide for a while. They have nothing but time on their hands to think about it and look around. And I would never have guessed how effective some of the things would be in terms of being able to hang themselves. But sadly, that is true. 8% were on suicide watch at the time of their death. 37% had been assessed by a qualified mental health professional. By the way, I tried to determine what the word qualified meant, and I couldn't really necessarily find. I'm sure if I had more time, I could do more research, but I couldn't find what sort of parameters they used. And let me just tell you personally, as a mental health professional, I know that very few people who graduate with degrees in psychology, counseling, social work, or other mental health fields have really quality training on suicide assessment prevention in their graduate programs. I didn't. You usually rely on working in a venue that gives you that really quality training on suicide. So if they defined it as a qualified mental health professional is somebody who has is licensed and degreed in a mental health field, I don't necessarily think that qualifies them for suicide assessment prevention. That's my personal opinion. I think we're not doing a good enough job of training mental health professionals across the board. But I don't know what that meant by qualified mental health professionals. 47 of the victims who were assessed saw a clinician within 3 days of their death. That is also a statistic that leads me to believe that we aren't training even our clinicians well enough to understand the risks and what to do about it. Let's move to the next slide. 35% of the suicides in this study occurred close to the date of a court hearing. 80% of those occurring in less than 2 days from a court hearing. That gives us some really important prevention information. 22% occurred close to the date of a telephone call or visit, with 67% occurring in less than 1 day of a visit. I'm guessing with maybe some difficult news or difficult conversations with someone who came to visit them. 77% provided suicide, of the jails where these were studied, provided suicide prevention training. 63% of that 77% either though did, or 63% of the total, not of the 77%, either did not provide training or did not provide it on an annual basis. And of the 77%, 69% that did provide training, it was 2 hours or less of training on suicide. Only 6% had a full 8-hour training on suicide prevention. So that tells you that the majority of training that was done in our jails was less than the amount of time you're spending today on this webinar. As someone who teaches and trains in suicide, that is woefully inadequate for people working with those who have such a high suicide risk. So even those that did training, not enough. Let's move to the next slide. 93% provided a protocol for suicide watch. So at least the majority of jails did have a protocol in place. Less than 2% though had the option for constant observation. They weren't able to keep an eye on someone constantly that was on suicide watch. 87% used a 15-minute observation periods. 35% maintained a mortality review process. So that means that only 35% of those jails reviewed a death and what happened and why and how it could have been prevented. 85% maintained a written suicide prevention policy, but suicide prevention programming was not comprehensive. So we've got a long way to go. Let's move to the next slide. This is a newer study. By the way, there was some controversy over the study that I just showed you previously. I won't go in depth about that, but I did want to reflect that some jails are doing better. And the most recent study that I found just this year, it did kind of reflect that. Suicide did remain high and was still the leading cause of death in local jails for 2016. However, there was a decrease between 2015 and 2016. So they are at least managing to go in the right direction. It was small, a 1.9% decrease, but it decreased from 1,092 deaths in 15 to 1,071. So they are making a difference. I can't imagine that there wouldn't be at least some focused effort on this because of the volume of the number of suicide deaths, and then the lawsuits and the cost. And I probably don't have to point this out, but the cost of just the lawsuits that we heard about and the payouts to the families in damages, we could do a lot of training with those millions of dollars. 40% of inmate deaths in 2016 occurred within the first 7 days of admission to jail. So we do know that the high risk period is that first window when people are entering the institution and first incarcerated. Let's move on to the next slide. These are general risk factors for suicide in general. So I'm moving away again from the correctional facility population to talk about general suicide numbers and risk factors, but we'll see a high correlation and why it makes sense that those numbers are so high for people within that first window of being incarcerated. One of the number one factors that increase suicide risk is a stressful life event, such as the death of a close loved one, financial loss, or legal trouble. We already know that. Prolonged stress due to adversities such as unemployment, serious relationship conflict, harassment, or bullying. But I would guess that being incarcerated is a prolonged stressful event. Exposure to another person's suicide, which is the contagion effect, and then access to lethal means at the time of increased risk. So all the first two definitely show that we have a much higher risk in jails. The only thing that's working for us in correctional facilities is that their access to lethal means are restricted. That's the only advantage that we have. Let's go on to the next slide. Mental illness is the most significant factor across the board. This is, again, the general population. We estimate that 90% of people who complete suicide have a treatable mental illness at the time of their death. Let's move on. I'm kind of move quickly here because I want to leave time. These are the issues that we see in the general population. We also see many of these in the incarcerated population: major depression, bipolar, substance abuse and chemical dependence, schizophrenia, some personality disorders, psychotic disorders, and PTSD. Let's move on to the next slide. Other key risk factors include previous suicide attempts, family history of suicide, serious or terminal medical conditions, and chronic pain. Let's move on. And we see that almost all of these risk factors are significant issues and common among incarcerated populations. We know there are high rates of mental illness and substance use abuse, significant history of trauma. I'll give you those numbers in a moment, and physical health or chronic health conditions. Let's move on. According to several studies, but this one from the National Center for Post-Traumatic Stress Disorder, in the general population, about 4% of men, 10% of women in the US will develop PTSD in their lifetime. In incarcerated or justice-involved individuals, 6% of males and 21% of females already meet the criteria for PTSD. Let's move on. I'm gonna, just in the interest of time, I'm gonna skip through one of the video clips. I'll tell you briefly about it, but let's go to the next. Okay, many more of the justice-involved individuals have been exposed to traumatic events in their life, such as domestic violence, neglect, emotional and physical abuse, and sexual abuse and sexual assault. Things that we know from the adverse childhood experiences are through the roof in the incarcerated population. Let's move on.
Jen, I just want you to know you have time, because we do have a 15-minute intermission, that if we bleed into that with questions, it's okay.
It's okay? Okay, I'll slow down a little bit.
Yeah, you're doing fine.
Okay. All right, let's move on though. As many, and this was startling to me, even working in trauma, as many as 90% of female inmates have had the types of trauma that we just mentioned: the physical abuse, domestic violence, childhood sexual abuse, or sexual assault. Some studies suggest that over 60% of male inmates have experienced trauma as well, either the adverse childhood experiences that we talked about or other types of violence related to street violence and crime. Trauma leads to a number of issues that contribute to suicide risk, including really resistance to talking about feelings and increased impulsiveness. So it would definitely increase the suicide risk. Let's move on. I still may skip the story here, the video clip, because I do want you to have time to ask questions, but I do want to mention our correctional officers. According to a University of California, Berkeley study in 2018, correctional officers are at a significantly higher risk for depression, PTSD, and suicide. The study focused on California state prisons. They showed that 10% of correctional officers said they had considered suicide. 31% of retired correctional officers said they had considered suicide. And just to give you a perspective, only 3% of the US population reports having suicidal thoughts. 1 in 3 correctional officers are dealing with PTSD. Half say they do not feel safe at work, and 1/3 report being affected by depression. So our correctional officers are really struggling. So the correlation of that is if they're struggling at this level, how much are they going to be able to really be available to the incarcerated and be on the lookout for that. Let's move on to the next slide.
Do you want to do the video or skip it?
Yeah, let's just skip the video in the interest of time, because I really want to get to this. We can always come back and show it if we have time, but I want to get to people's questions. So how do we make a difference here? This is an important part that I don't want to miss out on. The video clip was from a correctional officer talking about what they did, which was form a peer support team and get a lot of training in crisis and trauma and suicide. So increased training for staff and volunteers is critical. Training on suicide prevention, training on trauma and having a more trauma-informed approach, and training on mental illness. All of those things, if we don't do that, we just don't have a chance to really change the suicide rates. I believe education for families. I think if we can have information that says your loved one is going to be at the highest risk during this window of time, being able to give that information to families for them to stay connected, and give them just a little bit of training on how in that first window of time to be supportive, to offer support, what to say. Peer support teams for correctional officers to get them help, get training, and have peer support for them. And then one of the things that our organization is doing is create programs for the incarcerated that enhance their protective factors. And then, of course, what my organization is all about is making sure there are caring individuals that are going into our jails and prisons to be available for the emotional and spiritual support of the people who are incarcerated. And chaplains and volunteers are critical to this fight. The organization I work with, just to tell you what we're doing, we place chaplains in jails and prisons worldwide. We're currently in 22 states and 25 different countries. All of our chaplains also utilize volunteers. So if you're interested, I'll send you to our website. You can see where the facilities are located. Again, we're only in 22 states, so we may not be near you, but if we are, consider possibly being trained as a volunteer for a ministry to the incarcerated. We utilize chaplains because that provides a consistent presence for an ongoing relationship. Volunteers are great, and some of the other jail and prison ministries that do a fantastic job have people, though, that come in and out on a very sporadic basis. We provide chaplains because they're there day in, day out, every day. And it's that sort of consistent familiarity and constant that help build up the trust that inmates may be able to open up and talk about these, the issues that they're facing. Most of our chaplains are in jails. And so that for us feels like an imperative that we have more to do with regard to suicide. We also provide some programming that directly affects those risk factors that I mentioned. So just to tell you a few of the things we're doing, we'll go to the next slide, and I'm guessing there may be questions about this, but our particular organization has partnered with the American Bible Society. By the way, they do far more than just Bibles. They created a curriculum called the Trauma Healing Institute. It was initially created for churches, but one of the areas that it needs, the need is so great with regard to trauma, is in correctional facilities. So our organization came alongside and we just altered it for correctional facilities to provide an opportunity for people to come together in these facilities with trained facilitators to talk about the trauma in their past. And it's not a clinical intervention. It is a therapeutic intervention. So it's not led by mental health professionals, but the curriculum was developed by mental health professionals, people who know and understand trauma profoundly, but train people like our chaplains and volunteers to facilitate groups in which people can simply talk about the traumatic things that have happened to them, have that acknowledged and validated, and have their stories heard, as well as being given some resources for resilience. We're really just getting started with this program in the last 3 years, but we've had some amazing results so far. Both amazing results in the individuals that have gone through the program reporting how helpful it was to them, but also in the wardens and the officers, the correctional officers saying, we've seen a change. We've seen a change in the facility, in the milieu of the facility because of these programs. Let's move on to the next slide. Some of the other programs that we have already are providing are programs like Malachi Dads and Hannah's Gifts. They're curriculums for parenting. If the person incarcerated is a mom or a dad, there's a program that helps teach them and train them how they can still be a part of their child's life. It helps to maintain a connection to their family with a plan on how to keep that connection and then restore those relationships when they're released. Restorative justice programs are also a part of what we do. And then we're currently developing some training to donate to correctional staff and facilities. Obviously, there are some facilities that have the budgets to implement significant training. There are some that don't. In regard to jails, there are huge jails and with big budgets like Cook County in Chicago, Lake County in California, but there are a lot of very, very small jails and counties across the US that have very little budget for any of that to get any kind of training. Let's move on to the next slide. Well, I'm going to skip through this really quickly because I do want you guys to have a chance to have questions. But in terms of sources of meaning, and this comes from one of my favorite books, Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning, he talked about work, love, and courage being some of the sources of meaning. And it's some of what we're trying to do is help them connect to their relationships, being able to do something of significance, and how to have courage during difficult times, which we know that they're in. Let's move to the next slide. By the way, this is a quote from Man's Search for Meaning that Viktor Frankl, if you don't know that, a lot of people do, was a prisoner in a Nazi concentration camp, and he wrote this book out of that. He said, the prisoner had lost faith in his future was doomed. With the loss of belief in the future, he also lost his spiritual hold. He let himself decline and become subject to mental and physical decay. What we know is that having hope is critical, and we want to bring that hope to people who are incarcerated. One of the biggest ways we do that is having people that are there for them because they care about them, they matter, and they want to help them with the issues that they're facing. And I think that's one of the biggest things that we can do. We know that the ways of finding hope are relationships, again, trying to help them stay connected to family and friends, faith. And so our chaplains do try to incorporate whatever faith they have. And if they don't have one, connect them to something bigger than themselves, a sense of community and belonging. And because of most of our programs are done in groups, it does help engage and facilitate that. joy in life. And then last but certainly not least is redemption, which is so critical because so many people who are suicidal believe that they have ruined their life in a significant way. And obviously that can be true of people who are incarcerated, that they believe that. And our message is to tell them it's not true. Regardless of what your circumstance is in life, there's always the possibility for redemption, for change, and having someone who believes in you that's present is what can really make all the difference. I have a slide with some information about where you can find more about our organization, and whether it's our organization or one of the other many organizations, nonprofits that support people who are incarcerated. I would encourage you to think about getting involved in some way, whether it's through donation, volunteering, in some way. The mental health professionals that I know who have done work, whether it's volunteer with incarcerated, or the people who have done volunteering with our organization, say it's one of the most rewarding things they've ever done in their life. Feel free to email me if you have any questions that we don't have time for.
Well,
All right,
thank you, Ms.
Michelle.
Ellers. This is Michelle Lesson. I'm facilitating the QA for this presentation. We have a few questions I'm hoping you can address.
Okay, great.
One of our participants asks, why is the suicide completion rate higher in jails than in prisons?
I think it's higher because of the time frame. And there's two reasons that I think are general. One is we know that people are at highest suicide risk when that big transition happens in life. They haven't had time to acclimate. The depression is higher, their fear is higher, their anxiety is higher because they've been arrested and incarcerated. They've lost hope. And so there's a window of time before they've had a chance to think it through when they're in crisis. My work in the last 20 years has been with people in crisis. And that first period of time, and by the way, most people in jails are awaiting trial, awaiting sentencing. Some of them will be released from jail with time served, but a lot of them are going to eventually transfer to prison. But it's that adjustment period, being locked up for the first time, dealing with what's happened in their life and the reality, and being separated from all of their social support. That is the crisis period, that first 90-day period. By the time a lot of people get to prison, they've had time to adjust and adapt to that and figure out how to cope. So it's a very dangerous time. The other reason is jails don't have the budgets for things like mental health support, training, and then they don't have all of the things to prevent suicide as well. So there may not be as many people also paying attention. Availability of chaplains, availability of mental health, availability of nurses may be less in jails. So both of those are a factor, but I think it's the time frame when the risk is the highest for people.
All right, thank you. Someone else asks, what is being done to correct the lack of treatment of the mentally ill and addicted individuals in correctional facilities?
That's a huge problem. And there are almost all of the jail and prison ministry organizations, not just mine, are looking at that. Some of them are big into advocacy and advocacy for mental illness is huge. As you all know, I probably don't have to tell you, we need more education about mental illness in our society in general, but the education for those who work in the field of corrections is lacking. Getting quality mental health clinicians to go into that field is a real challenge, and getting more in-depth and specific training about mental illness. But that's true across the board. We need more training in understanding mental illness in certainly law enforcement and every aspect of the whole for justice involved individuals from the beginning to the end. The other thing that's a significant issue is the number of people who are incarcerated because of drug violations. And what they're really doing is self-medicating mental illness. And until we can get more mental health support and understand that the use of drugs is really almost universally for many, many people about self-medicating a mental illness, then we're not really going to make a significant difference in this. So it's about education, training, and then programming, as well as policy change to help get people the help they need rather than just incarcerate them.
Thank you. Is there any research on why white males complete suicides in correctional facilities more often than other ethnic groups?
It's, you know, that's true in our society in general, not just incarcerated. So that's where we see a mirror of society in general. And I can tell you, and I haven't seen research specific to the incarcerated population, but I can tell you in general that there are a few factors that are higher in other ethnic groups. A sense of belonging and community, a sense of faith, and then resources and the ability to have people to come alongside you to talk about what's going on. And that sense of community we know is a resilience factor. Our lowest number, sort of in general, our lowest group, ethnic group and gender is Black women. So I've often in class said, ladies, tell me, why are Black women have the lowest rates? But in one of the answers I've gotten back that isn't reflected in the data I've seen is we've learned coping skills. So let me say this. The groups, minorities, women, you know, people of color have had to learn how to cope with a lot of pain and a lot of problems. They've already developed coping skills. White males may have not had as much bad stuff. And I don't want to offend any white males out there that have had a lot of bad stuff, but you may have been insulated from the level of pain and trauma for a lot of your life and not developed the skills to cope with tragedy. And that's at least, so I'm saying anecdotally, that's what some of us believe. There's no way to know for sure the whys, but we look at the data and go, what do we think? What do we think is a reason? And I know that that's one of the theories that, you know, those ethnic groups have developed coping skills that get them through really hard things.
Thank you. I have two more questions for you. Of all suicides, what percentage are of those who are not getting treatment for addiction?
Right now, a lot. And like I said, at least with correctional facilities, we don't have data more recent than 2016. So the opioid epidemic that has really exploded since then, I think as we see the data coming in, we're going to see that. A higher and higher number of people, a large number of the people who are incarcerated in jails are there because of, like I said, drug violations. The studies don't really say exactly what. And so it's a little hard to tease that apart, but I know it's a huge factor. What I was shocked by is the number of people that are still abusing substance and addicted while incarcerated. I'm new to this field, so I was like, they still get drugs in prison? Okay. And then, you know, my chaplains look at me like, you're naive, and I am about this. I thought, well, it would be obvious. I actually had a family member myself who she's struggled with drug addiction, my cousin's daughter. And when she finally got incarcerated, we thought, great, this will be, she's going to get off the drugs and maybe she can turn her life around. And I was shocked and appalled to learn that she was able to get the drugs when she was in jail. So it is still a huge problem. And I think if we have to get more training, more programs, and definitely institute in correctional facilities for opioid addiction, or we're just going to see this skyrocket even more.
Thank you. Our last question is funding an issue regarding the lack of proper surveillance in jails?
Yeah. Funding is an issue across the board, but my question right now is we need to maybe redistribute the funds, because if lawsuits because of suicide are paying out millions, and these are settlements, by the way, if we're settling for millions, then there's a reason that we need to find the funding for those things. So I think funding is always an issue. Again, the smaller the jail, the smaller the facility, the smaller the budget. But yes, that's always an issue. And that's why nonprofit organizations that come in can also make a real difference. We can raise funds to donate it. So of course, we still have to be invited in. We still have to have a relationship with correctional facilities and being given that opportunity.
Thank you for being so thorough answering our questions. We have no more of them for you.
Thank you so much.
All right, Jen, thank you. I also went ahead and checked YouTube. We didn't have a question, but we did have a thank you for the great presentation. So what I would like to do now is share the slide for our upcoming presenter. And we, let me double check. We are not going to have, I think, a mindfulness session this intermission. Just one moment while I check. No, okay, I don't think so. But what we are going to do is give you a wholehearty thank you so much for this wonderful presentation that you did. I think I'm going to, I did that a little bit out of order. Thank you so much for sharing these wonderful resources with us. And now I lost you, sorry. And all of the insight that you have. I mean, you know, you're one of my favorite teachers / trainers because you know everything as far as I'm concerned. But I would like to go ahead and invite everyone to go ahead and take that 5-minute break that we have. We do have our next session coming up in just about 5 or 6 minutes. So please practice some self-care, stretch, walk around, refill your coffee, and we'll see you back in about 5 or 6 minutes. Okay, welcome back. It is 12:15, so we're going to go ahead and introduce our next presenter. We have the wonderful, wonderful, wonderful Miss Kimberlee oh my goodness, I think I misspelled her name, Ratliff, coming up next. If I can just take a moment to praise her. She is just one of the best people that I know, and I truly am honored to just get to learn from her. She is actually one of our chapter advisors, and she teaches me so many things in so many ways. And I think she doesn't even realize how much she teaches me. So I just wanted to take that moment to once again formally thank you, Dr. Ratliff, for everything that you've taught me and how you've led our chapter so wonderfully over the years. So I'm going to go ahead and hush and go ahead and pull up your presentation. So then as soon as you see it there, we can go ahead and get started. Actually, while I'm doing that, Michelle, if you wouldn't mind making the announcement about the post survey for me, that'd be great. Michelle, are you there?
Yes, I am. Are you talking about, would you like me to enter this in the chat box or?
No, go ahead and just verbally say it for the recording.
All right. We have a post survey. We would love if everybody would fill it out. It will be emailed to everyone who has registered for the symposium. So we would love to have your feedback. So if everyone would fill that out, we'd be very grateful. Thank you.
All right, Ms. Ratliff, I'm sorry it's taking me a moment. If you want to go ahead and break the silence, I'll have it pulled up here in just a minute.
Sure thing. No, and so much pressure. Thanks, Ree. That was really sweet. The introduction. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. Well, those of you who don't know me, while she's pulling up the presentation before I get started, just a little bit about me. I am a former program director here at American Public University and currently part-time. I was a program director for I guess 9 years, almost 10 years actually. And now I'm back on a brick and mortar campus, but I'm still very active at APUS, particularly with some student organizations such as Active Minds. So it's great to still be a part of this because it's super, super important to me. So my presentation, and while she's getting that up, I kind of want to know who my audience is. So if you're in the audience today, tell me if you are, my presentation is really going to focus on campus and college campuses and the college population. So tell me, are you staff, faculty, students? Are you parents of students? If you guys wouldn't mind telling me who you are, maybe what school you're in. Thank you, Dr. Ed. School of Business is here. So just kind of let me know who you are. I'd really like to know who my audience is. Awesome, Sherry. Okay, great. Oh, staff, yeah, of course you are, Janet. Janet's also a co-advisor. She's another advisor for Active Minds. So thank you for being in here, Janet. All right, DSA, awesome. APU alum, yes, of course, Michelle. Oh, awesome. Criminal justice faculty, okay, great. Indiana Wesleyan, awesome. So today what we're going to talk a lot about is campus and campus culture and how to become a caring campus, which involves all of us. Rhea, if you want to go ahead and change to the next slide. Just a quick disclaimer, because I hear this a lot when I give this presentation, particularly to faculty and staff. I'm not a mental health professional. I feel like this is too much for me to do. And so when you think about this, a training like this to kind of teach you some tips and things about how to have a caring campus and how to work with students doesn't make you a mental health professional. You're correct. And so you are not responsible to become a credentialed mental health professional after this session and you have to go assess for suicide. That's not what this is about. It's about you being part of the community of support. And so I have this picture here just to kind of remind us that yes, we are professionals and we still need to stay in our swim lane. So if there's something a little bit beyond, you know, what you feel capable of doing or competent to do, there are resources available, and I'll be sharing that with you as well today. All right, next slide. Okay, so let's get started. Let's think about normalizing the need for help. So mental health issues are very common. I think if you were in the last presentation, you saw some of the statistics. And just to normalize that even more, if you think about it, just in the general population, 1 in 5 adults in America will experience a mental illness within a given year. 1 in 5. If we were in a big auditorium, I'd have 1 in every 5 persons stand up and kind of look around the room and see what that looks like. You may know someone, you may be someone who has been diagnosed with a mental disorder, mental health disorder. And so it's really common. And so one of the tips that is in the Active Minds publication, they coordinated with the Association of College and University Educators, and I was involved in consulting with several other faculty across the country on some of these tips for faculty and staff. And one of the things that we talked about a lot is just normalizing the need for help. There's still stigma out there. And so to break down the stigma, we have to make it a normal thing for people to talk about mental health issues. Just like physical issues. If a student comes to you and says, oh, they are in the hospital for a heart attack, you're probably not going to expect that paper to be due that week. The same should be the case for mental health conditions that interfere with learning as well. So what's the number one thing you can do, particularly if you're an instructor, but this can also be for staff and anyone working on a campus, is to be approachable. And I also kind of add in there relatable. In the survey that Active Minds did, be approachable was the number one thing that students were asking faculty to be. And so when you think about this, students are sometimes not going to share with you about mental health illness they have or a situation with you unless you're someone that they feel like they can talk to, someone that they can relate to. And so making sure that you're setting the stage for them to be approachable is really important. Okay, next slide. So, okay. This is where the chat's going to come in. So we have a lot going on in 2020. Mental health and coping has been kind of in the news quite a bit lately, related to the physical distancing, related to campus culture, and some campuses starting with students and having to quarantine students, and some of them shutting down and going to online. And you know, students are feeling disconnected with their groups that they're affiliated with, or even just being on the campus community with their friends. And so we think about all of these different things happening across the country, from COVID to the recent hurricanes to, I'm in the Pacific Northwest. So the fires out here on the West Coast have been a tremendous concern, and have threatened around some college campuses. And then we look at the racial injustice and talking about, you know, the issues happening there that are impacting our students, and students in all walks of life. You know, these things are very heavy and weigh very, very heavily on us. And so I'm curious to hear from all of you if you have seen, you know, impacts in your community related to any of these natural disasters, you know, things that you're concerned about with COVID, things that you're concerned about with racial injustice. And if anyone wants to kind of chime in here, I'd like this to be a little interactive. Any thoughts? Okay. All right, maybe you guys will chime in a little bit later on that. Fires, yeah, in Southern California, absolutely. Yeah. I know my son is a senior this year, and one of the schools he was looking at was UC Santa Cruz, and I think the fires were getting very, very close to that campus. COVID and causing isolation, absolutely. Political tensions and divisions, absolutely, Virginia. There's a lot of, and especially if you're on social media, right? That's really cluttering our information and really giving us an overload. And Sherry, yes, the isolation being overwhelming. And thinking about particularly traditional college students, thinking about that this is a time when, you know, belonging and being around friends and being around their fraternities and sororities, sports, you know, all of these things that are a part of normal everyday college life, you know, have changed. Yeah, Janet, the border to Canada being closed and being apart from family. Being in Washington State, there was a story of a married couple, and one of them is here in Washington, the other one in Canada, and they would just cross the border and see each other, and now they can't do that. So they actually had a camera of the fencing, and one of them standing on one side, one on the other, but they couldn't even give each other a hug because they'd be violating, you know, international boundaries there. So yeah, so a lot of those things are happening that's changing the landscape. I think I missed one. Amount of hatred online, yeah, for people, and lack of inclusivity, yeah, absolutely. So there's just so many things going on in our world right now that are making things even more complicated to an already normalized, you know, mental health is a thing that we're all dealing and when we think about 1 in 5 within a given year being diagnosed with a mental illness, that's pretty significant. Another thing to think about too regarding statistics is that half of chronic mental illness begins by the age of 14, and 3/4 of that is by the age of 24. Here at APUS, our student population is average of the mid-30s, and so when you think about even statistics of, relating mental health and suicide, that suicide between the ages of 14 and 34, it's the second leading cause of death. So these are very, very serious things we need to be thinking about, and then normalizing it and breaking through the stigma. One of the Healthy Minds studies in 2018-2019, if you're not familiar with the Healthy Minds study, it is for college students, and it is a national study, probably the most prominent one that many people working in college know about and participate in. Related to stigma, 47% answered that they would think less of someone who received mental health treatment. So think about that for a second. 47% would think less of someone who has received mental health treatment. So there's still a long way to go in terms of stigma, and being able to, normalize this. And so as faculty and staff and people who are supporting our students, we have to find ways to make it okay to not be okay and to talk about it. That's really important. All right, next slide, please. So here's a few of the statistics related to the Healthy Minds survey, and I do have the 2018-2019 data here. I'm sorry about eating disorders, that's 10%. It looks like it got off on my slide. But when we think about college students and mental health, it affects productivity, it affects academic achievement, GPAs are definitely affected, withdrawal and failure to respond. Those of you who work with online students, sometimes you might reach out to a student, hey, I noticed that you were missing in the discussion board today, and you don't get a response, and you don't get a response, and you don't get a response. And it can be a little frustrating trying to figure out if the student is okay, but that can be a sign that something is going on. And then persistence and retention, there is definitely a financial aspect to this too, that several students who have mental health disorders drop out of college and they don't finish, they don't graduate. So there's many different effects that mental health can have on student performance and persistence and retention to graduation. So you can see on this chart, the latest, they actually just released the 2020 winter data, and I'm excited to kind of dive through that very soon. But for now, we're going to look at some of the major issues that were noted in the data from 2018 and 2019. And we'll look at non-suicidal self-injury, which I know the previous presenter talked a lot about and what that is. That is not the intent to die by suicide. It's more of that release. It's a kind of a coping mechanism for some, but 24% for non-suicidal self-injury. Severe depression at 18%, and I want to note that that's severe depression, not all depression. Depression in general is more in, like, I think it's about 36%, I believe, for depression overall, but 18% severe depression. 14% severe anxiety, which anxiety in general is kind of in the 30s. It used to be that depression was the major concern, but anxiety has been creeping up over the years as equally concerning to depression. And many people have both. You can have depression and anxiety, which makes it even more challenging. And then suicidal ideation at 14%, and again, eating disorders at 10%, which it's important to note that eating disorders is one of the most fatal mental health disorders. So it's really important to pay attention to that with our campus populations as well. All right, next slide. So I've heard a lot of people asking, so what about the impact of COVID? And our National Active Minds organization actually did a survey on this and found some really interesting information, probably not super surprising to you, but they found that 1 in 5 of college students say their mental health has significantly worsened under COVID-19. So that's concerning, right? So we already have 1 in 5 Americans have a mental health disorder or illness within a given year. And now 1 in 5 college students are saying their mental health has significantly worsened. And 80% report that COVID-19 has negatively impacted them in some way. Some of those things that the research found is that 76% have trouble maintaining a routine. How many of you have experienced that as well? I know just being out of a routine can really throw you off and get you kind of, out of the norm. I think we're all living in a time that's a little more uncertain. So that can be, play a role on our mental health. 73% are struggling to get enough physical activity. One of my hobbies is doing half marathons, and many of my half marathons were all canceled. And so just the lack of motivation to get out and train because my races are all canceled. And so students are having trouble getting that motivation and getting the energy to get up and participate in their normal physical activities. And 63% find it challenging to stay connected with others. This is a huge, huge issue. So staying connected with others, belongingness is a protective factor for suicide. So when we have many of our college students saying that they're, having trouble staying connected, that's definitely a big concern. But it's not all gloom and doom, thankfully. I do want to point out that 79% of the students who are surveyed do feel hopeful about the future. So, so that in itself is also a protective factor against suicide. Hopelessness is a risk factor, and so having hope is definitely a good thing. All right, next slide. Oh, yep, there we go. So what does that have to do with suicide? So in the Healthy Mind study, 14% reported having some sort of suicidal ideation. So thoughts of suicide was pretty common. Those who had a suicide plan were at 6% and a suicide attempt at 2%. And again, the non-suicidal self-injury at 24%. So it's really important for campus faculty to know the warning signs, right? To kind of know what to look for if you're going to be kind of one of those gatekeepers and helpers in this process. If we left it all to the mental health professionals, that's quite a lot for them to carry. And so they need everybody to help support this effort. So some of these suicide warning signs, I'll let you take a look at them and not read them, to you. But you can see on here kind of the link between alcohol and drug use, which, can also be concerning on a college campus. Feelings of anxiety, searching things online, and even on Facebook. There are many of our students are using Facebook and Twitter and TikTok and all of these things. And so if you see some concerning things with online behavior as a parent, I saw that there was at least one parent in here, or a friend. Those of you who are students, if you see friends doing that, that can be kind of a red flag that they might need some support. Another thing to really be mindful of is if students are saying things like they're a burden to others. This can even come across very subtly. So if you are a faculty member or a staff member and the student says, I know I bother you too much, or I know you're probably really tired of me emailing you. Some of those that kind of language might indicate that they're feeling like they're a burden to you. And so really just reassuring them that, they are no bother and that you're there, that's what you're there for, and you're there to support, can be helpful. So what are some things that you can do if you are working with a student or a friend? I know some of your students on here as well. If you're or even a colleague. Those of us who are faculty and staff are not immune to thoughts of suicide. We're not immune to mental illness. And so there is a tip number 2 in this publication that talks about actively listening. And this is actually developed by Active Minds, and it's a 3-step process called validate, appreciate, refer. We call it VAR for short to help you remember it, but it's 3 simple steps. And I really encourage you to either print this out or keep a copy on your desktop just to remind you of these steps if a student is in need of support. The first step is easy, validate. That makes sense. That sounds difficult. The worst thing that you can do is minimize how someone is feeling, because that might indicate that, oh, they're overreacting or they're exaggerating their symptoms or whatever it might be. So validating their experience and really helping them see that you're listening, and even if you don't understand from their perspective, it gives the sense of yeah, that makes sense that you would feel that way. This is really overwhelming. I would be overwhelmed too. Really kind of normalizing and validating how they're feeling. The second step is to appreciate. So you appreciate the student's courage in sharing. Thank you for sharing that with me. That must have been really difficult to share. Or thank you for trusting me with that information. It's just a little appreciation, which helps you become more approachable, right? Which is the #1 thing that students need. And then the next step, this is where I'm not a mental health professional, what do I do? This is where you refer. And a referral doesn't always mean, you might have a student who maybe it's not a mental health concern, but maybe they're having difficulty with the work in the class or the difficulty with writing, knowing where to send them for extra support, for academic support. If it is a mental health related thing, knowing where to send them for mental health support, even inviting them to say, hey, I would like to connect you with so-and-so. If you're on a physical campus, you can even ask, would you like me to accompany you and walk you over to the counseling center or the chaplain office or whatever service you have on campus. Disability services is also another good resource. Maybe there's a student who, confides that they have ADHD and they're really having a hard time keeping up with their assignments. They're, feeling really disorganized and may need some accommodations. Disability services can be there to help that student and get them the support that they need. Any other resources you can think about, whether you're online or on a campus. Students, what other resources can you think about? I know there are a few of you in here. Yeah, Ree, yeah. Thank you for trusting me with your story. Yeah, I think that's really important. All right, any other resources you can think about? All right, we can move on. So tip number 3, there are, oops, going backwards. There we are. Tip number 3 is don't be afraid to add well-being activities into your classroom. There are many, many different things that you can do to support students. And when we think about the rates of suicide, we think about mental illness, we think about even the studies with graduate students, even for example, and things, populations that are really struggling with mental health. You can do things in your classroom. Hey, Ree, the slides are kind of bouncing around a bit. I don't know if you can get back to the...
I know, I'm so sorry. My keyboard is freaking out. Just one moment. Let me get it back.
Okay, no worries. I just want them to be able to see the different strategies here. So I'll just share a couple, and while she's working on getting back to the slide. So for example, I have moments in my day that I'm very open with students about. for example, if something is weighing really heavily, like the fires and the smoke and the things that were happening, and so I was dealing with that, dealing with the things happening with in Louisville with Breonna Taylor, and there were just so many things that were kind of clouding my mind, and I needed just a break. And then I had 3 losses. 3 family members passed away within a week and a half during COVID. Not all of COVID, but it was just a really, really rough time. And instead of kind of keeping that to myself, I shared it with my students, and I made this rock in the corner. It's a mandala rock. And I just signed up for a class, and I said, I have got to do something. And so the next class week, I posted the picture and shared with the students what I did for my own self-care, and that I just needed a break, and this is how, you know, I process that. So it's okay to share tips, and you know, it's okay to be human with your students, and let them know that, you know, life is stressful. There are things that happen, and there are ways to cope with it, to get back on track. And so I shared this picture, and I am not an artist by any means. It took a little bit of courage to share this picture, but my hope was that it would encourage students to say, hey, my professor is doing this. She's stressed out, so it's okay for me to be stressed out. So maybe I need to find an outlet. So just being that role model and sharing those things can be kind of empowering for students, that it's okay to not feel okay, and there are some things that can help you get back on track, whatever that might be for you. Sharing self-care tips in the classroom, and also creating homework. I will share with you that when I was teaching human growth and development here at APUS, I posted a self-assessment of self-care, and the very first assignment in that class is for them to assess their own self-care, and then they are to pick a couple of areas that they feel like they want to improve, and their goal for the class is to initiate that self-care activity throughout the whole class. And so it was built in as an assignment. It was built in as a, okay, this is something that you need to do. And I can tell you, I got such positive feedback from students doing that assignment. It was one of their first courses in a graduate program. And I had some students outside of my program to take the course as an elective, and just hearing their comments of, wow, I've never really had a class where we did something that was really for us, you know, that really spoke to me and you know, helped me kind of focus on my own stress level and stress management. So that was a really positive thing for them, and also very encouraging to me that that was helpful. Another protective factor for suicide is having problem-solving skills, having resilience. And so any ways that you can facilitate that in your classroom, when there are major events going on, it's okay. If something happens during the week and your students are stressed out or exhausted, take some class time to talk about it and process it if your students want to do that. Reserving a little bit of that time to process and walk through and talk through can be very helpful. It's not just shoving it under a rug and pretending it didn't happen, which is something we don't want to do. But then also modeling problem solving and decision making, and modeling those things with them as a group can help facilitate their own resilience. Another recommendation is to share wellness resources with your students. So we also talked about a protective factor for suicide related to belonging and connectedness. And I know campuses across the country, APUS included, have student organizations. A student organization is hosting this symposium this week. So finding ways for students to get connected and to belong, and recommending to students, hey, did you know that you know, this organization is available? You know, Active Minds, I like to get my colleagues to post about Active Minds and the things we're doing to help students get connected with us specifically, that maybe you don't have an Active Minds chapter where you are. So any student organization that would help get them connected and help them get that sense of belonging can be a protective factor. We also have a student success center with resources and things in there. So, sharing that in a classroom announcement, reminding students about the resources that are available to them can be helpful. And believe it or not, college is stressful. Life is stressful. There's a lot of things happening, particularly when we think about non-traditional students. They might be juggling work and family and maybe even sacrificing their career. Maybe they have an internship and they have to take a leave of absence. And so now they're financially, struggling or stressed out. It's okay to give students a break every now and then, and not be, oh, it has to be turned in by 5 o'clock on Friday, no questions asked, no late work will be accepted. So being flexible with students and understanding and being empathic about their situations can really help students out. And giving them a break. If you have a major assignment due, let's say in week 5, don't have anything major due in week 6, or give them a little bit of breathing room to kind of relax after they've had a lot of time to dive into a research project or, a presentation or something that you've asked them to spend a lot of time on. And building in mindful meditation. Every now and then I will post some little from Headspace specifically. They have a couple of free videos on YouTube, and I'll just, post a little link there and say, hey, if you're feeling stressed this week, take a little time, take 5 minutes to take a little break and do a little breathing exercise. And the other thing in this publication that I want to point out that I know that we don't do so well at APUS, but maybe we can advocate for, those of you who are here, is rethinking assignment deadlines. So along with mental health, sleep is really important. And I think sometimes our midnight deadlines of, by Sunday at 11:55 p.m. it has to be turned in. Sometimes that ends up with students waiting until that time and then cramming and hurrying up and staying up all night to get that done. And so I'm thinking about kind of the impression that we give students that our deadlines, are 11:55 p.m. or midnight. So making them more reasonable to not encourage them to be staying up all night working on their homework and their assignments. Next slide. And this one is super important, faculty and staff, that you practice your own self-care. I know the phrase or the saying, you can't give from an empty cup, right? Or you think about the airplane with, put your mask on first before you help someone else. And the same is true in academia. And thinking about, if we're not taking care of ourselves as professors, as student affairs professionals, as anyone who's working with our campus communities, if you're not practicing your own self-care, you're going to be less likely to help others. So making sure that you are taking some time to laugh, taking some time to exercise, taking a pause during the day when you just need to stop and breathe and do a mindfulness exercise, go enjoy nature, anything that you can do to help reinvigorate yourself and be able to be available to your students is really important for you. So I do a presentation on the 3 selfies, and I like to remember it this way for my own self-care: just self-care, self-talk, self-compassion. That, the self-care activities, keeping those at the forefront of my mind and making sure I'm taking care of self, making sure that my self-talk doesn't get me down. That doesn't mean that you have to be positive about everything all the time. There is kind of what's termed lately as toxic positivity. You don't have to be positive or be quiet. That's a meme I see all the time, and I'm like, not quite. But being mindful of how you're talking to yourself. For example, before this presentation, thinking, okay, am I going to say anything valuable? If I was thinking to myself, I have nothing important to say, then I wouldn't probably be sharing, enough tips that are going to be helpful to you. I'd be kind of talking down to myself. So instead thinking, you know what, there's some great information in this publication I want to share. I think it's going to be valuable. So really just watching that self-talk. And then self-compassion. We make mistakes. Even professors, even if you're the VP of a university or a provost, or we all make mistakes. And so not perseverating on the mistake and having some self-compassion, understanding that we're not perfect, and just having compassion for yourself when things are not going well. So just keep those 3 selfies in mind. With your daily work, with students, with yourselves, with your families, with your friends, and that might help in terms of protecting your own mental health. And then finally, just some final tips for challenging the stigma. So we talked a little bit about statistics and recognizing that mental health issues are common. So making sure students are understanding that it's okay not to be okay. It's okay if you have depression. If you yourself, as someone who's working with students, has experienced that, or maybe you had a really difficult time in college, it's okay to share those little bits and pieces of, I had a really difficult time and this is what I did, and it seemed to help me. I'm wondering if you're willing to try that. We're guiding the next generation, and some of us are working with non-traditional students who have so many things going on. And so just being that relatable professor or staff member or campus community member that students can relate to and go, you know what? I remember when so-and-so said that they were having trouble in school and this is something they did, maybe it's worth a try. Maybe it'll help me too. So it's okay to share things like that with students. Keep high achievers on your radar. I didn't share too much about the statistics with this, but Active Minds did a study of college students, and 91% indicated feeling overwhelmed. 91%. So stress, overwhelmed feelings, those are all very, very normal. And so keep those high achievers on your radar. You may remember, I'm not sure if you do, but there was this student at the University of Pennsylvania who was high achiever. She's, really good in school. She was a gifted athlete. Nobody knew anything was wrong, and she died by suicide at just a very, very young age. I think I can't remember what year in school she was, but the pressures of high achievers can be tremendous. So even if they're doing academically well in your class and smiling in your class and you think everything is okay, be sure to check on those students as well, and just check in one-on-one when you can to make sure that they're doing all right. Using destigmatized language, so making sure that you're putting the student before a disorder. If a student reveals to you they struggle with depression, you wouldn't go and tell your colleague, yeah, my depressed student. So it's a student with depression. Same thing with when we're talking about suicide. We no longer say commit suicide. That carries kind of a negative connotation. Instead, we say things like die by suicide in order to give dignity to the individual. So making sure that your language communicates that normalcy and destigmatizes how you feel about mental illness in general. Really supporting them with communicating help seeking is a sign of strength. There's still a stigma in our society that it's a weakness to go ask for help. And so breaking that down in any way possible. And that can come through even sharing your own story of a time when you needed help and how that was beneficial to you. So just making help seeking a normal thing as well. And then advocating for campus mental health best practices. If your campus doesn't have support for students related to mental health, or they're not really talking about it on campus, being that advocate and saying, hey, we need to talk about this. We need to have a forum and a space for students. I know when I came to APUS, it was something that I noticed in my classes quite a bit, that students would share some very, very personal things that they were going through. And I thought, you know, I don't know if they're aware of all the resources that are available. And I felt like I stumbled upon finding out about Active Minds and decided to bring that to the campus and provide that forum for our students. So if there's things like that, that you're like, you know, I don't think our students have a space to talk and to feel like they can connect and belong to people that also struggle with mental health, or maybe they have a passion for helping, a passion for destigmatizing. You know, I think it's a significant need across campuses across the country. And so finding ways to support that and make it a normal conversation on your campus is really important. Next slide. Okay. All right. So this is the publication that I've been kind of talking about, and all of these tips and more are inside the Creating a Culture of Caring. This is geared toward faculty and staff. Well, mostly faculty, but also staff, I would say, can benefit from the tips in this as well. There is a link on this PowerPoint. I know you probably can't click it from the Zoom slide, but you can Google this and search on the Active Minds website. The publication is available there. And it was an awesome experience to work with faculty across the country and really talk about, you know, how to destigmatize mental health and how to get students talking, because it's affecting a lot of them in many ways. So that's what I have for you today. I hope you picked up a few tips along the way. I'm here for questions if anyone has any questions.
Thank you, Dr. Ratliff. This is Michelle. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Excellent. I'd like to share questions with you at this time. We have some questions that were submitted before the symposium that I'd like to ask you.
Sure.
Our first question is, what are the methods that tend to be used by those who complete suicides on college campuses?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I will say, just like the previous presenter, Jennifer talked about, you know, that firearms are significant, that there are, you know, over 50% of completed suicides are by firearm. What many campuses are doing is they are banning weapons from campus, like a zero tolerance kind of policy, which is super, super helpful, because then you don't have the access to the means, which is exactly what you do in order to mitigate that. I would say alcohol and drug use, you know, is something to be concerned about. So poisoning, I have a few statistics related to suicides of young people in general, so not just college students, but the main ones are firearm, suffocation, and poisoning. So just being aware of medications and things that they might have access to, as well as suffocation. And there have been some very public stories that have been shared where they've actually, you know, jumped from an apartment building, things like that. So in general, firearms are still a huge concern with young people, even though campuses typically don't allow that on campus. And so I'd say, you know, that's still a pretty prevalent problem.
Thank you. Someone is wondering if you can speak to the incidence rates of suicides on college campuses at state schools compared to Christian schools.
Oh, interesting question. So there's not a ton of research on that, to be honest. There is some research. There is a study that was conducted by the College Students Suicidal Behavior Study, which was, I think it was back in 2012, if I'm remembering correctly. And an interesting finding is that, religion is considered a protective factor. And there's a couple theories about that. So they think that because it encourages social connection with other people, and that possibly, at Christian schools, they might have lower student faculty ratios, so the community might be closer and tighter knit, that maybe there's less suicide on those campuses. But I will say that the research isn't very conclusive. The secularity of the institution, there hasn't been a direct relationship aligned with it. There has been some studies that there are some gender differences. For example, female students who attend non-secular institutions are less likely to consider suicide. There's still questions and theories about why that is. It might be culturally linked. But as far as overall and in general, there's not a significant difference between the two.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
My next question is as follows. I can see how very recent data may not be available, but do you have statistics on suicides that relate to our pandemic?
Yeah, so that is kind of an ongoing thing. I will say, though, that definitely COVID-19 has certainly thrown a wrench into things, and it has become, mental health has become an increased concern. So even before COVID, suicide and mental health is certainly very, very common. I do have some statistics from a study back in June that I can share, though, that states that 40% of US adults reported struggling with mental health or substance use related to COVID. Some of the things that came out of this study is that anxiety and depression symptoms, around 31%, trauma and stress-related disorder symptoms, about 26%, and this is a concerning one, started or increased substance use, 13%. And we know that there is a connection between substance use and suicide, and so that's something that's very concerning. If you have those who are experiencing anxiety, depression, and they're using substances, I'd be very concerned about those friends and family.
Thank you. We have two more questions.
Mm-hmm.
Someone is asking, do you think that the suicide epidemic is a more serious epidemic than COVID-19?
Oh, wow. I don't know that I would commit to what's more. I will say, though, suicide is a public health crisis. It is. It's been increasing for years. And there's studies you can look back from 1999 up until now and how the rates are increasing. It's the second leading cause of death for age groups from all the way from 10 to 34. There's a presentation that I give about suicide rates across the United States. And every single state had a pretty significant increase except for Nevada. They had a 1% decrease. Everywhere else, it was even in some states up to 30% increase for suicide. And that was the latest reporting data from 2019. So it's something that we really have to take very seriously. I think COVID adds another layer to it. However, I wouldn't dismiss the seriousness of COVID either. I've had people in the family, pass away from COVID, friends who have been hospitalized. So I think we both need to be taken very seriously. But I would agree that, suicide is still a public health crisis.
Finally, what advice do you have for helping faculty to be more open-minded to the impacts of mental health?
Mm-hmm. Great question. So this kind of goes back to, that stigma, right? And developing empathy for students. I think sometimes the best way to do that is letting students share their stories if they're comfortable. And even talking about your own stories with your colleagues. That can be helpful just so that they can, if they've never had to struggle with mental illness or they've never had someone in their life, which I doubt with how common it is, I'd be surprised if that wasn't something they've ever had to deal with. But I think really bringing the human connection to it and how it affects people's lives is kind of a window in for that empathy, and then being able to relate to something a student is going through. Hearing is, I think there's such power in hearing and sharing people's stories. There's just a human connection I think that we all have that happens through that.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ratliff. We have no more questions for you.
Okay, great. Thank you guys so much for listening. I have tons of other research and data, but I know our time is limited, so I appreciate you being here.
Dr. Ratliff, if there is any last minute stats or anything you do want to share, we have just a couple of minutes to spare, because our next presentation doesn't start until 1:30. So if you want to, go for it.
Well, I'm curious to hear if anyone is familiar with graduate student mental health. This is something that is like really important as a graduate faculty member. And I don't know if you're familiar with the Big 10 study, but I wouldn't mind sharing a little bit about that, having a little extra time. And I think it's very relevant to us too, not just at the graduate level, but considering that non-traditional students in the Big 10 study were at the highest risk for suicide. And I think that's something we need to pay attention to for those of us who are working online, and we are working with a lot of adults who, do have their own careers happening. They're going to school, they have families, they may even have caretaking responsibilities for older family members, and all of the stress going on with all of that. So just plus financial stress of going back to school, all of those things that we really need to be mindful of. So when we think about, it's not just an undergraduate traditional college student issue, it's also graduate and non-traditional student issue. So it's not just within that specific age group that it's a concern. So I just want to mention that, just briefly. I think I also kind of skipped something related to COVID that I think is important to consider as well, that in that survey that I mentioned earlier, that seriously considering suicide, this was done in June, so it was a CDC survey in June, and those who are seriously considering suicide, 25.5% of those who took the survey between the ages of 18 and 24 indicated that they're seriously considering suicide, as well as 21.7% of essential workers. So think about that, how COVID is affecting our essential workers. And then unpaid caregivers, so people who are staying home and quarantining and taking care of others, was at 30.7%, and minority, racial, and ethnic groups at 18.6% for Hispanic and 15.1% for Black individuals. And so that's pretty heavy to think about the percentages there who have considered suicide, related to everything going on with COVID and so many other things happening. There's not a ton of information about the reasons why, but you can probably imagine, how the social distancing and the lack of connection and belongingness that's happening in some respects. Some may have lost loved ones to COVID, or maybe they already have anxiety, and so they have increased fear of contracting COVID, or being even, restricted from their normal everyday routine. So there's a lot of reasons that might be happening, but I think that's some pretty important data to keep track of.
Thank you so much, ma'am. And just to tie that in with what Dr. Cooper shared yesterday, one of my main takeaways was this is temporary. Like, even though our quote unquote new normal, I'm so over that phrase. But even though life going forward might not look exactly like it did before COVID, This that we're in right now, this isolation and this crazy time, is not forever. It is temporary. And I know that's what kind of helps keep me grounded. Also, obviously, just focusing on mental health, my mental health. In fact, I admittedly focus more on my mental health than my physical. I need to be more balanced. But that's just struggling with self-care, which is an everyday challenge, right? So anyway, I'm just so pleased and delighted that you shared all of that with us. It's so important, especially with our special campus demographic. But I do love how it was kind of broad enough that it really, of course, can apply to anyone, like be approachable, right? That's pretty much universal. So what I wanted to do now is go ahead and honor the break, unless, Miss Michelle, we have any other new questions that have popped up.
I'll just add one more tiny little thing, Ree, if you don't mind, before we go.
Sure,
of course. I do want to leave it on a positive note, because I know this is really heavy stuff that we're talking about, and talking about statistics that sound, you know, kind of rough. But I want to share just from the mental health side that telehealth has become, easily accessible. Many professionals are now providing telehealth. And so even if you're not able to physically go to a counseling office, many mental health professionals across the nation are getting trained on telehealth and how to use it and how to do it safely and confidentially. And so there are lots of opportunities to meet with a therapist or meet with someone if you are struggling or you know someone struggling, and maybe you can't leave the house, but that's okay. That's not a restriction, that you have access to care, even in these times. So I just want to mention that, because I think that's a huge resource that needs to be remembered and not forgotten.
This is Michelle. I'm confirming that we do not have any outstanding questions.
Awesome. Okay, great. I see Jen hasn't made it back yet. Dr. Ratliff, I'm going to go ahead and show our screen for our next presenter. And I was wondering if you wanted to play the music, or if not, I will on this side. Uh-oh, you're muted. You're unmuted now. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say, I don't have it up, but I don't know if people can.
Okay.
I'm still not sure how people can hear it from mine.
It's okay. I'll just play some music from this side.
I can actually put the link in the chat though.
Okay, so here's what we're gonna do. I do see that one of our panelists has arrived. That's amazing. I'm so excited. So I'm gonna go ahead, as I promised, go ahead and throw up our preview slide for our next presentation, and invite you all to once again practice some self-care. We will pick back up right at past. And I also wanted to tell you that I'm going to attempt to play some nice relaxing music here for you. If you don't want to hear it, I guess you can turn down your volume, but we kind of voted unanimously that some type of music would be nice during the intermission. I will be here though for any questions or chats privately, or if anyone needs anything in the interim. And I'm going to go ahead and pause the recording now. And then if you need me, I'll be here. If not, we will pick back up at past. And I will say this, if Jen is able to show up in time, I'll see if she wants to do one of the guided self-care activities. So anyone who wants to hang around can do that as well. Thank you so much
for inviting me. My story began 22 years ago. I was attending the American Association of Christian Counselors, and that's how I met actually Jennifer Ellers. If you're a professional counselor, you need certain amount of continuing education credits. And so I was attending a conference in Nashville along with 7,000 other Christian counselors. And after like the first introductory session, I called home, and my husband is a pastor and he's a former engineer. So he's not someone who really, I don't know, he gets to the point. And I saw him stammering as I asked him how everything was doing. My oldest son, John, at that time was 22, and he had a history of bipolar and mental illness. But before I went to this conference, I was pretty sure that John was stable. But then when I heard my husband stammering, I said, "What's wrong?" And he said he shot himself. And with that, I fell to the ground. I was screaming, "No, no, no." And different people were walking past me with these white name tags because we were all trying to get to the first session. And two women stopped who were from the conference, and they took me to their hotel room. I just immediately felt just a loss of strength. Like I had been a runner and was very active, and yet I lost physical strength. I didn't even know if I could make it to the elevator. We were at in Nashville at the Opryland Hotel. So if you've ever been there, that's a huge place. And it's miles and miles long. So to get to the hotel room was also a trot. And when I got there, they had alerted the hotel staff, and Jennifer Ellers came to my room, and she was at that time Jennifer Cisney, and her now husband, Kevin, came to the hotel room to minister to me. And that was beginning of my recovery. I don't remember what questions they asked me, but what better place to find out that your son or that anyone committed suicide than in the midst of 7,000 Christian counselors. They were kind to me. They made plane reservations because at that point, you're just totally devoid of your thinking processes. You just need someone to take you by the hand and do it for you. And they took me to the airport. Kevin took me to the airport. I arrived back in Philadelphia area, which is my home. My husband had done all the phone calling of having people from out of town come in and letting everybody knew I was not able to do that. By the time I got home, my daughter from college was flying home. I have 4 children. John was the oldest of the 4. And so then we began making the funeral arrangements, picking out a coffin, doing things that a mother never thinks she's gonna have to do. And I don't remember a lot of that. I just remember that I'm a Christian, that God was with me. He was holding my hand. John had trusted Christ as his savior years earlier, so I knew I would see him again. And yet the here and now was very, very painful. John had only lived in Philadelphia 1 year, and yet there were 700 people at his funeral. That's just the kind of guy he was. He was very winsome, and so I don't think a lot of people saw the dark side. He was very funny, very athletic, very handsome. He loved people, and so there were 700 people at his funeral. But the funeral ended, and then within a few days, family members left. My extended family is from Chicago, so they all left, and we were back with just my husband and I and our 3 kids. And that's when the healing journey continued. The cards would flood into our house. We would get so many cards that I was actually couldn't even keep up reading them. We just I know our mailman knew something was going on. And then, the day after John died, not after he died, the day after the funeral, I went back to work, and I'm a professional counselor, and we needed the money financially, but I think one of the things I felt like I needed to do was to keep structure in my life by listening to other clients who had all different kinds of things. At that time, I didn't have anyone who was suicidal, which I was grateful for. I was able to focus on them and at least get a little bit of a break. I would cry on the way to work. I'd cry on the way home. I really was just doing what had to be done in life, not all the things that need to be done. I'm sure I ignored my other 2 children and my other daughter who went back to college. I just didn't have it in me. So I really do believe that getting back into routine was something that really did help me, because I sensed that grieving this loss was going to take more than a few weeks or a few months, and I was right. So getting back into my routine, grieving as it came, was really helpful to me. Self-care was very important. I never had trouble with sleep before John died, but then after he died, sleep became an issue. And so I began to take over-the-counter like Benadryl type of things to help us sleep. My husband and I, we both were able to talk to each other about John's death. Our kids really didn't want to talk about it, because typically, I think Ryan was a sophomore in high school. Jessica was, she was in college. She was 21, going to be 22 her last year in college. And Rachel was a senior in high school. I don't really remember Rachel's senior year. I know I didn't help her with college applications and things like that, but somehow, she was able to navigate that on her own. But I didn't put a lot of pressure on myself, because I just knew I didn't have it in me. So, the structure was good for me. The self-care was good. One habit that I had even before John died was I would get up in the morning, and before work, I would pray and I would journal. And the journaling was just so helpful. Just to take things out of your head and put it onto paper is just so therapeutic. On my journal, sometimes I would write about John's death. Sometimes I would just write about how I was feeling. Sometimes I would just write what my schedule was that day. But just clearing my head was just a really helpful thing. And my sister, who lived in Chicago, she began calling me every week and checking in on me. And before that, we really didn't have a close relationship. So that was someone that really helped me kind of process some things. And then a friend helped me to process some things. So just you don't need a whole army of people, but you do need a couple of people. And sometimes the people that are very supportive of you are people you wouldn't even expect. And so that's also important to recognize. It's so very easy to get derailed after the loss of someone special to suicide, because there are so many things you can get mad at. Like, some of John's friends knew he was suicidal, and they didn't let us know. And so I could get mad at that. And yet I just chose to believe that somehow John was determined to hurt himself, and it was going to happen. And the woulda, shoulda, coulda wasn't going to get us anywhere, because John was gone, and I needed to grieve that. I could have gotten angry at doctors along the way who misdiagnosed him or refused to believe that it was as serious as we were telling them. And yet I realized that anger would get me nowhere. There were some people who I thought would be there for me who were not there for me. And yet that was just too much energy to even get angry at different people. sometimes when people lose someone to suicide, it's easy to blame other people. And I just knew that that would be a dead end for me. You know, grieving the loss of someone to suicide, someone close, and specifically a child, is going to take everything you need and more. That first year was brutal, it's just very, very hard. And then the second year wasn't that much better. And then by the third year, I think that the initial pain, wasn't as painful, but it was still very deep. And then, you know, I'm 13 years out from this, and about 10 years ago, I started writing about grief and loss because I thought I was done grieving, and I realized I wasn't. And so there still was more healing. It's just amazing how long the healing takes for suicide and for the suicide of a loss of a child. When I became a grandmother 4 years ago, and then when my granddaughter began playing with these toys, we had these Duplos, which are like building toys, and we had saved them because they were special to our kids. And so when my granddaughter began playing with those toys, it triggered me. And so I went to counseling. Initially, I didn't go to counseling for losing my son because, frankly, after working and coming home, I didn't even have energy to go to counseling. And I really wasn't interested. Maybe us counselors are more difficult, but I just didn't really want to go to counseling at that time. But then 10 years after, I went to counseling. And then 2 years after that, I did EMDR, which is a type of trauma therapy, because after I saw those Duplo blocks, I realized that they were also a trauma for me. And so those are some of the things that I did, you know, to heal from the loss of my son. His gravesite is about 2 miles from our house. Sometimes we go there for a walk. Now we just do that for his birthday and then the day that he did pass. So that's very helpful to have a place that we can go and we can remember him. There are certain things that we've done through the years that have remembered him. Like for his birthday or for the day that he passed, we will wear yellow because that was his color. So I'm still crying, but you never really get over the loss sometimes, but there are things, but it can change and you can be in a better place. And one of the reasons I'm doing this is because I feel like I want to use the pain that I've gone through to help me to help other people. So I hope that was helpful to you.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Well, first, of course, sorry to hear about that you had to go through that. It's one thing that's one club I hope I never join, right?
Right.
The loss of a child. But thank you again so much for sharing. I'm happy to hear, though, that you listed so many things, right? That you're able to share these resources with those listening that helped you to heal. And also, I like that you said you're still grieving, because that's okay, right? When people say, well, that was like 6 years ago, or right, like really dismissive things like that. I'm not violent, but sometimes I want to punch people in the face when they say stuff like that. I don't, but I want to, and I admit it. And it's because even if they think they're being helpful, it's just not, right? I'm also glad to hear you share what people did, right? Like Miss Christie shared yesterday, do something. There isn't anything we can say to make you feel better, really, or to even comfort you, but we can do stuff, right? And so I like that you mentioned some things people did. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Miss Hannah. I am going to do a general request. Whoever's speaking, since you're unmuted, don't try not to move your hands or touch stuff, because every like little thing like that shows up on the recording and we can't hear you. So I'm going to go ahead and zip it, and I'm going to introduce Hannah once again, who I just love. She is a powerhouse Wonder Woman, if you ask me. She's so young, and she does more than 3 people, I think, in any given day. But she also is very supportive as one of our chapter officers. And we're just one of the organizations that she is some form of officer. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Miss Anna. Thank you.
Thank you, Ree. I'm already going to start crying. But like Ree said, I am highly involved in a lot of different areas of life. And this overachiever mentality started probably before I was born. I was born super early. I walked early, I talked early, I learned to read early. When my dad would be describing the kids, he would say, oh, my sister Sarah's kind, my brother Stephen is strong, and I'm the one that's going to change the world. And you would think that my parents would, who are both very involved in mental health care, they're not mental health experts, but they are very much involved in self-care, would have picked up that such language is not something you should use on a person who is an overachiever, but they didn't. And by the time I was 12 years old, this idea that I have to change the world manifested in my head, and I developed anxiety, I developed OCD. It just was not great. I did get help for my mental illnesses, but unfortunately, it wasn't effective. When I was 15, I'm not going to go into my life experience for that because that is a very personal thing and I just am not ready to share it yet. But I began having suicidal thoughts. I did not think my life was one worth living. I hated myself. I hated looking in the mirror. I felt like I was a failure. It didn't matter what anyone else was telling me because I was telling myself my life was not one worth living. And at 15, even if you're aware of the suicide hotline and you're aware of so many different things, you don't know how to explain what's going on in your head. And you don't know how to reach out for help, especially in our society that doesn't teach kids how to ask for help. So I struggled silently for 2 years with suicidal thoughts. I never attempted suicide. They never got that bad, but every single day I had this feeling of the world would just be better off without me. I'm not doing any good. Why should I be here? And I was listening one day. One of the things that I found that helped would be listening to slam poetry from people who had mental illnesses and hearing their struggles. And I was listening to one, and I wish I remember the name, but it was basically "Don't Kill Yourself." And it was a list of reasons not to commit suicide. And one of the reasons was just tell yourself to turn off the lights, give yourself one more night, and if you want to kill yourself tomorrow, you can do it. And I was probably 15 and a half when I heard that. And I was like, okay, I think that's fair. I don't think I can make it another year like this. I don't think I can make it another month like this or another week, but I can do another day and maybe it will get better. So I went to sleep that night and I said to myself, if you want to kill yourself tomorrow, you can, but you just have to make it through one more night. And the next night I said, if you want to kill yourself tomorrow, you can, but you just have to make it through one more night. And I said that every night for a year and a half. And this is my first time sharing this story, so I'm going to apologize that I will probably be a mess. But I did that every night for a year and a half. And then one night I went to sleep and I thought, I'm excited for tomorrow. And then I cried, not because I was sad or depressed or anything, but because for the first time in my life, the idea of making it through another day wasn't dreadful or awful. And I could imagine what next week looked like, or what next year looked like, or what next, 5 years looked like. But for a year and a half, I couldn't let myself think that far ahead. And I am obviously cannot speak to every person who has suicidal thoughts. But from what I understand from speaking and talking to other people, it is very, very hard to imagine living for another year with the struggles that you go through. It is unimaginable to have to suffer for that long. And if I had not heard that poem, if I had not had someone else tell me, you know, you don't have to think that far ahead, you can just think through the next day, I don't think I could have made it. But that's what I did. I didn't force myself to think through the next week. I just made myself think through the next day. But I'm not really here to talk about exactly what went on in those 2 years. I'm here to talk about how I got through it and how I am the person I am today. And that was the biggest thing, that motto of, I don't have to make it through the next week or the next 5 days, just the next night and the next night. And the other was, I didn't reach out and ask for help, but there were people in my life who did notice that I was hurting. My best friend, I call her my platonic soulmate. She was the first person to see through all of the busyness and productivity that the face that I put onto the world. And she was the first one to say, you shouldn't do that. You shouldn't be doing this much. Are you okay? How are you doing? How are you actually feeling? Are you taking time to breathe? And it was this knowledge that someone else out there not only cared that I was struggling, but someone else out there was noticing that I was hurting and loves me, that helped me get through it. I know a lot of people who never go through with committing suicide say, I don't do it because it's going to hurt my mom or it's going to hurt my dad. I didn't do it because I didn't want to hurt my best friend. When I tell people I had suicidal thoughts, they are always shocked, because I don't seem like a person who would have suicidal thoughts. I have every self-care resource you can possibly imagine at my fingertips. I can tell you the suicide hotline number by memory. I am a future marriage and family therapist. I don't seem like someone who would struggle, but I did. And I struggled for a really, really long time. And I'm not saying I'm grateful that I struggled, because I'm not. I was a child. I should have been able to enjoy the last few years of my youth without fighting a battle that some people never get to survive. But I am grateful for who it made me today. Someone who knows that literally anyone can suffer from suicidal thoughts. From the person who looks like the perfect candidate, the person who is overachieving. I am thankful that it has given me a passion for mental health advocacy. And most of all, I'm just thankful that it has made me more aware that people struggle with things that we could not even imagine, and that we have to be kind, and that we have to be nice to everyone. Even when it seems like the most impossible thing, when you're arguing with someone whose political ideology disagrees with you, or you're having a conversation with someone who just seems so bitter, you have to be kind, because you have no idea what that person is going through. And sometimes all it takes is saying, I hear you, I understand that that's your point, and I'm glad you had this discussion with me, for that person to say, wow, someone else values my opinion, and my opinion matters, and therefore my life matters. I don't really have much more to say. When I tried to write what I was going to say today, I could not put it onto paper because I could not figure out what I wanted to say. But just, if you are currently suffering from suicidal thoughts, you do not have to think that you have to make it through the next year or whatever. Just promise me, promise yourself you can make it through the next night, because believe me, you can. And one day there won't be, I have to make it through the next night. There's gonna be, I'm excited. And your life is one worth living. And I am so grateful that you're here to live it today. And you will be thankful to yourself 5 years in the future that you stayed and that you gave yourself a life to live. Thank you.
Hannah, let me take a moment. I'm glad you didn't write down what you said, because what you said was perfect. I think it was what you needed to say, and I think it was what people needed to hear. So thank you for sharing your story with us. Thank you for being so vulnerable and so open and honest. this is a type of thing that we do that gives life, right? Like someone heard or will hear that testimony and say, maybe that'll work for me, right? Like they didn't even hear the poem, but you shared what you heard and what worked for you, and that probably will work for someone else. So when you think about that, that's saving lives, right? Like that's why we do what we do. And all it takes is for someone that someone else can feel a connection with or identify with or think, wow, well, if she can do that, maybe I can too. That's the power, right, of our story. I'm so proud of you for sharing that with us. I know it wasn't easy, and I just love you even more now. I hope my praising doesn't make you feel like I expect anything more than you already give, but I super love to acknowledge when people put their heart, life, and put their foot in it, as some old Black grandmas might say. That's just a reference to good cooking. Sorry. It's life-giving, and I thank you for that. So I just want to recap one of the things that you said that was so powerful, is you said for 1.5 years you did that every day. And I'm not sharing my story, but I will connect with when I was in my lowest mental place due to a medical disorder. I would say at no point did I think of suicide, but every day I did wonder what my self-worth was. And every morning it was a battle. Every morning it was an absolute mental battle, sometimes physical, right? Just to get out of the bed. And every day I would have to be like, no, you are not going to talk down to yourself. You are not going to degrade yourself today. You're not. And I'm thankful that every day I had that battle. And probably 98% of the days I came out victorious by about 11 a.m. right? But in saying that, I have a wonderful boss who is supportive. I see she just hopped on the line, and I'm blessed that if I'm feeling low, I know I can go in her office and say, hey, can you take your supervisor hat off and just be a mentor friend right now? And she'll listen, right? That's so huge to have even just one person. And so I believe that's something you can also do now in giving forward, right? Paying it forward is being that one person. That's so powerful. So thank you. Okay. I get myself together. All right, I'm gonna go ahead and pass it along to Miss Ratliff, not Miss, Dr. Ratliff. Hopefully you're ready. I'm gonna go ahead and mute and take it away, ma'am.
Okay, thank you. It's hard to follow that story, which is so powerful, and one that I think we can all just take a deep breath and hope that we're there for someone who needs to know that they're worthy of the next day and the next day. So Hannah, thank you so much for sharing that. I want to take you guys just on a brief journey many, many years ago, back to 1981, if you were born by then. So back in 1981, I was 5 years old and almost just probably about 3 weeks away from my 6th birthday. So imagine me in pigtails. A lot smaller, a lot skinnier. And I was at my grandma and grandpa's house, and we lived just down the street from them, and they lived in a tiny little farmhouse, probably no bigger than about 1,000 square feet. And it was just kind of in the country, a space that I really loved as a kid. And I was playing with my brother. We were playing store. I like to pretend to set up a grocery store and let him come and pay with fake money. And of course I'd upcharge him and, try to take all his money and get him to buy everything in my store. My brother was just 2 years older than me. And I remember just hearing sobbing in the kitchen right next door to where I was playing, and just sobbing. And at the age of 5, I heard the word suicide for the first time. I didn't know what it meant, had no idea, no clue what was happening. I just knew people were really sad, something really bad happened. And there's this word that I don't really know what it means. come to find out, my dad's brother had come by and broke the news to my mom that my dad had died by suicide that day. And it's been, what, 39 years, almost 40 years ago. He was 29 years old, very young. And it was an experience that, you know, you would think at that age, you don't really process what's going on, and you really don't. My mom was a saint, and she did kind of all the right things, even in the midst of her being in her young 20s herself and not really knowing exactly what to do. She gave me the option to go to the funeral or not. It wasn't a forced experience. I chose to go to the funeral, but not to the burial. I'm not sure why. I didn't really, maybe I just didn't want to see, you know, him lowered into the ground. And I just remember silence for many years. Nobody talked about it. It was a stigma. My dad's family, he came from a Southern Baptist family. His dad was my grandpa was a Southern Baptist preacher. So it was very hush hush. Nobody talked about suicide. That, you know, no way, we can't really talk about that. Huge stigma surrounding it. And so for many years, from the age of 5 until about the age of 15, there was no discussion of it. But my mom wanted me to remember my dad, even though at the age of 5, I really don't have very many memories of my dad. If you think back to when you were 5, you know, you're playing, you maybe have a few memories of kindergarten, maybe, but no, I didn't have a lot of memories of my dad. And so another awesome thing my mom did was she gave me an 8x10 black and white picture of my dad. And I kept it in my desk drawer for years. Like it was always in my desk drawer since the age of 5. And I remember when I was a teenager is when I finally started talking about it. I think this is kind of like a delayed grief. So like 10 years prior is when I lost my dad. And around the age of 15, 16 is when I finally processed it and could talk about it. I was in an age where I understood what that meant. I understood the word suicide, and I could actually talk about it by then. To be honest, I would pull out, even though I don't really have memories of my father, I would pull out his picture and talk to him. So I created this fake relationship, I guess you could say, but it was very, very real to me. So I could talk directly, see my dad in this picture, and pretend like he was responding back and giving me advice and telling me what to do and all those things. So much so that when my mom did get remarried to a military guy, years later, that I used to always say, "You're not my dad." And then I'd go to my room, pull out my picture, and start talking to my dad and telling him how horrible my stepdad was. And it just became kind of like my coping mechanism for myself, because the family didn't really want to talk about it, right? It was very, very hush hush. But around the age of 15 or 16, I remember my mom being my person. I think Dee mentioned that you don't have to have a whole ton of people of support. And a lot of times, you know, you might be afraid to support someone, but having one person that's just there, just physically there. They don't have to say or do the right things, just being there and being able to listen to you and empathize with what you're going through. And that was my mom. We had many conversations about my dad. She would tell me stories about my dad when I would ask. Never said anything negative, you know, about him, so that I could create the image of who my dad was, because I was really searching, I think at that time, as who am I? I didn't have a dad, so who am I? And I think it got me through, you know, that teenage period of time. But I will say, it also, having that experience so young, I also went through, I felt like I was living in this tunnel. So imagine a tunnel, kind of dark, full of shame, full of guilt, full of, you know, what ifs, you know, what if my dad was here? What if life was different and he was around? And so I was kind of living in this space where I always wondered, what if dad was still here? What if? And I kind of still felt a little bit of shame, like, did I do something wrong? did he want to leave us for some reason? Did I make a mess in the living room? And so he, you know, he couldn't stand it anymore. And so he took his life. And so there was still a lot of shame and guilt and everything that kind of went along with that. But when I heard, it was kind of funny when I heard Jennifer talk this morning and shared about Viktor Frankl and his book, Man's Search for Meaning. It was actually right behind me when she mentioned it this morning. And he talks a lot about suffering, and that suffering is a normal part of life. And from suffering, you can find your purpose. And I feel like at the end of my tunnel, where the light came to me was my purpose. And I realized when I was in college, still kind of going through some of the grief and still the what ifs and all of these things, that yes, this thing happened to my dad. Yes, this happened to my family. It was a terrible time. And yes, everyone didn't want to talk about it. It was very secret, you know, you don't share it. But I found my purpose from my dad. I haven't said that out loud. I found my purpose from his suffering and turned it into my career. And so when I share my story, a lot of times I think about, and gosh, I haven't cried sharing my story in quite a long time. When I think about that, I think even though he wasn't here to give of himself while he was here, he gave something to me that I can carry on and hopefully be there for anyone else that's going through the same experience, or to maybe even prevent another 5-year-old little girl in pigtails from losing her dad to suicide. So yeah, so that's a little bit of my story. And I would say what got me through all of those years was having my mom, having faith that something good was going to come out of something that wasn't great in my life. And I'll tell you that I participate every year. It's just an annual thing. Every single year I participate in the Out of the Darkness Walk with the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention. So if you ever are in a situation or you know someone that feels alone, what's amazing is that when you go to a walk, you realize you are not alone. There are many, many people that have experienced the same thing. And so that's what my beads are for today. I put on my beads from the past couple years. And AFSP says, you know, you wear gold for a loss of a parent. And this past year, I actually had to add a purple for loss of a dear, dear counseling mentor friend of mine to suicide as well. So I really encourage, you know, if you find yourself in that situation, in addition to finding your own ways of coping, reaching out and connecting to people who've been through the experience gives you empowerment, helps you feel connected, and can get you through. So that's my story.
Well, there's a frog in my throat. So I've known Dr. Ratliff since early 2017 when I started at APUS on my slow crawl of a journey to complete this new degree. And that was a very powerful line that you said, because you've changed my life and I'm just one.
Oh, man.
So nobody wants to hear a recording of me crying. So what I'm going to do is say thank you yet again. I have a very short, not very, I don't want to sound crotchety, but I do have a semi-short list of people who I think of when I think of who I want to be, and you are on that list. So with that said, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Miss Michelle, if she can share any questions we already have. And then after those, I'm going to open up the room, the floor, if you will, so anyone in the room can unmute and ask questions directly of any of our panelists. We also have Dr. Cooper. Her video is not on, but she is here. She shared yesterday in the symposium And then Miss Jennifer Ellers is also here. She spoke earlier today. And so they are here if there's a question that comes up that you want to ask. So go ahead, Miss Michelle.
So I just want to thank you, the three of you, so very much for sharing. And I will include each of you on my prayer list. I'm a Christian. I am so moved by the sharing. I'm moved to share more of my struggles going forward because of what I've heard from you today. And I want to share one question that I have received before the symposium. If any of you wish to address this, the question is, how do you feel about the response of the medical and healthcare communities to the epidemic of suicide?
Just to be sure, you all can unmute yourselves, right? Or do I have to do it? Michelle, do you mind repeating that question?
Yes, no problem. How does anyone feel about the response of the medical and healthcare communities to the epidemic of suicide?
Right. Does anyone have any feedback for that?
I'm not sure that I might be a little biased, knowing that I am a mental health professional. And so I kind of know the behind the scenes of things that are happening in terms of prevention and intervention. However, things are not perfect, right? We have a situation where suicide is increasing and we need to find new ways to address the problem. I would say, I'm not sure if they're relating more to health community, like doctors or you know, those who are closely related. But I think the stigma is changing. I think we still have a long way to go. I think there probably are still some providers who maybe do overlook or minimize, you know, referrals and help. But I think there's been an increase in training. I know specifically for licensed mental health professionals or counselors in Washington State, we have to have suicide training every 2 years to renew our license. It's a requirement. It's not an add-on or a, hey, go take this professional development. It is a requirement. And so I recently just went through a CAMS training. And so the evidence-based, they're doing a lot of research on evidence-based approaches, which the training I just had really kind of coincides with Hannah's story quite a bit, that just give me one more session, just give me one more session kind of approach. And so I think there's a lot of improvement needed, but I do think the community is taking it seriously. And I think that we're really looking for new and better ways to deal with suicide for sure.
Hey, I just wanted to add a comment to that, if that's okay.
Ma'am, go ahead.
Hey, what I was going to say is we're seeing a flood of coaching coming into, we're seeing a lot of universities that are adding coaching, a lot of institutions that are adding coaching, which is different than counseling. But I think that even though we're seeing more in counseling, that we're also seeing more on the coaching aspect of people seeking help, because as Kimberlee was talking about, in coaching, I don't think that you see the stigma that you do as in counseling. As per se, there are some cultures that may have a stigma to say, oh, I'm seeing a therapist, as opposed to, oh, my coach said the other day. And so there's not that stigma of saying, oh, they're in therapy or whatever. It's almost a, you know, a classy thing to say in some groups, oh, my life coach said this, or my mental health coach said this. But if we say therapist or counselor, that may not be, you know, accepted in their family or within their culture. So I do know that I think to help with the increasing need for mental health, that we're seeing a lot of coaching coming in. Unfortunately, I think that we're seeing less in the ER in some of the hospitals because certain things are getting turned away. Even medical reasons, I had a friend that needed shoulder surgery, and she was being pushed into the operating room when they came out and said, we're sorry, but the director says we've got to stop everything except COVID-19, so we've got to take you back. So of course the insurance started all over again, and she had to wait, another 2 months before she could have this very needed surgery. So I think we're not seeing the same numbers in crisis in the ER, but we're also seeing numbers in coaching and in counseling. So I guess my point I'm trying to make is that even, it is an epidemic, and we need all the folks that we can get to reach out and help. There are other alternatives that are out there that we may or may not be familiar with at this time.
Thank you for sharing that, Dr. Cooper. Also, I just love hearing your accent. It makes me happy.
When I do a presentation, people look at me for the first 5 minutes like, well, where is she from? Is that Texas? Is that South Carolina? So I just go ahead and cut to the chase usually at the beginning so they can concentrate on what I'm trying to say. No, that's Georgia. So hey, y'all, and thank y'all for letting me talk.
Thank you. I love that you mentioned the coaching. People do kind of brag about having a life coach, and I'm like, hey, more power to you. I want to also say I've been hearing a lot about, what is it, BetterHelp? Have any of you all heard of BetterHelp, I think it's called? I hear it on the radio and in some of the podcasters I listen to, and it's all about mental health resources. So I'm going to mute, but I'm going to allow everyone else to unmute now at this time, and anyone can speak up and ask any questions.
So I have a question, and I've never really shared this, but my father passed away 10 years ago from cancer. And at that time, my mother was already deep into Alzheimer's to the point where he couldn't take care of her any longer. And he was diagnosed with cancer, lung cancer, at the same time as a result of exposure to Agent Orange in Vietnam. At the time that he was diagnosed, he was stage 1. My sister-in-law is an oncology nurse, retired now, but an oncology nurse at that time. And we wanted he and my mom to move up to San Antonio so that we could take care of him. My sister-in-law assured him that he would get the best treatment possible. The cancer that he had was actually treatable. And he turned it all down. He gave up. He wanted to die. He was so deep in depression from taking care of my mom. He had always been extremely healthy. I mean, the most he ever got sick was with an annual sinus infection. So he was always very, very healthy. So when, battling my mom, because she was at that stage in Alzheimer's where she was running away from home, she would be physically and verbally abusive with my dad. It just got really bad. And so we felt that he gave up purposely when he could have fought it. He had time. And I'm so angry about that because I feel like, in a sense, it was suicide. He didn't have to die. He would be 88. It's been 10 years this month, and it still hurts, and I still get angry. And I don't know how to let go of that. So technically it wasn't a suicide, but to a certain degree, I feel like it was. I'm sorry. So how do you cope with the anger? it's 10 years and I'm still, I pray and I ask God, and I feel like I'm over it. And then things hit me again and it starts up again. This has been a stressful week, so this just kind of adds on to it. So I'm sorry, I apologize.
I just want to chime in really quickly and just say what you're describing is part of the normal grieving process. And so being compassionate with yourself and understanding this is, anger is part of it, right? It's sadness, anger. And I think what's hard for some people, kind of like what Ree was mentioning earlier, how people are expecting you, oh, that happened 10 years ago. You should be over it by now. But guess what? Grief doesn't have a specific timeline. It doesn't. And I would imagine that behind, that anger is still, some sadness that he's not here. And I'm curious if you've thought about, I know that there's a lot of great groups. Particularly, I know hospitals have a lot of groups that people kind of going through some similar things to be able to, kind of learn and grow from it together. I know that takes a step to get to somewhere, but I know many of my clients who in the past have been through similar things where terminal illness and things have kind of gripped their family, and many of them deciding, that this is really too difficult to keep going through treatment and to, go through life in that way, and been able to kind of connect with people in the same place to help get through that anger and grief. So I know this isn't a counseling session that we can jump into, but I hope that gives you some hope that there are some resources out there for you. And if we can help get you to them, I would be more than happy to offline share some of those with you.
Well, and I actually did see a therapist for a couple of years because coupled with that, I was going through the dissolving of a 28-year marriage, and my dogs died, and then my mom died 18 months later. It was like I just slammed over and over and beaten down, and I'm okay until I get close to his anniversary and my mother's anniversary, and then it all bubbles up again. So I just wondered, is that normal? Is it just me? I mean, I loved him. I was very close to my parents, but yet that I'm not angry with my mom because hers was a process that she had absolutely no control over. And in reality, we lost my mom way before we actually lost her. If anyone understands that with Alzheimer's. But with my dad, he didn't have to. And in a way, I feel like I took it personally because I felt like he didn't love us enough to want to try and stick around. Instead, he gave up.
I can identify with that. I felt like my grandpa didn't love me or us enough to hang in there for a long time. And I also felt like he gave up. And then I felt guilt, which sometimes still creeps up, because I'll share a little bit. I was a single woman, newly divorced, and I felt I let my family down. He was just counting down for grandkids and great grandkids, sorry. And I was the oldest grandkid by far. And I think he thought that was coming when I got married and I got divorced. And he would, I'm not going to say beg me or hound me, but he brought it up a lot. Like, so when are you going to have a baby? And I remember thinking, Grandpa, I'm single and I just started grad school and I'm divorced and I don't even know if I'm ever even going to have a date again, and I would just play with him. But knowing he did that so much and how I gave him so much life, I felt guilty. Like if I would have just had a kid, he would have had something to live for. Which I know now is silly to put that blame on myself. But for years I did. And then when I had my son, for the first probably 6 or 8 years, I felt guilty. I felt it was my fault. If I would have not only seen the signs, right? Since he reached out to me, both attempts, and I was the only one he reached out to. If I would have known, if I could have, would have, should have. And I also realize now that is a very dangerous game and it's not helpful. or fruitful to say what you coulda, woulda, shoulda done, especially if someone else decided to harm themselves. But I was so angry at him and then angry at myself and the guilt. And I don't know if all that's normal either, but I know a lot of people have those feelings as well, especially the guilt.
Yeah.
My story is slightly similar. I haven't lost a parent, thankfully, to anything. But when I was 11 years old, my mom was diagnosed with a autoimmune disease, and then another. And then we found out she had the BRCA1 gene, and she was likely to get breast cancer. And it's been several years of struggling. But I remember being 16, and the doctor telling my mom, you should look into removing your uterus, just doing all these preventive stuff, and in order to survive for your kids. My mom said no. And I was so angry with her because right now she's probably not going to make it till I'm 28 or 29. When with that, she probably would have made it, probably will make it through my 40s. And I'm still very angry with her that she's still refusing to have these surgeries. She's at risk and increased risk, and she could make all of our lives better, and I don't have to grow the rest of my life without my mom, potentially. So I understand. I'm still living through that my parent is alive and I'm angry with them, but it's the only way I'm able to cope with is it's not my body and it's not my decision to make. And yes, I'm impacted by it. And yes, I feel like it's a selfish decision, but at the end of the day, it's not mine to make, and it's not my fault if she makes the wrong one. And it's the only way I can still have a relationship with her that isn't fighting consistently. And I don't know if that helps or not, but that's what I did to cope and what I'm doing to cope.
Miss Jen, do you have anything to add to any of these comments so far?
I would like to say a couple things, Ree, absolutely. And first of all, let me normalize anger is absolutely a normal part of being a suicide survivor. It would be unusual if you didn't. Some people aren't angry at the person who took their own life, but most people have that, and it's very normal. Feeling guilty or the I should have done more is absolutely also normal. Let me mention a couple things. The woman who just told us about her still dealing with this 10 years later, that's not unusual. And especially because she mentioned multiple losses. And we forget that no loss happens in isolation. It happens in the context of a life. And if you're trying to take the emotional energy and time to process a tremendous loss like that, and you have all these other losses, then you have to give yourself time, because your body and your mind know that you can't do it all at once. The weight of that's too heavy. So you compartmentalize that. And that means that maybe months down the road, in some cases years down the road, there will be a piece of that pops up, and then you need to deal with that. So it is not unusual. It is not abnormal, especially if you've had multiple losses in complicated situations, to be grieving something 10 years later or still be angry. So don't feel like there's something wrong with you in that. Secondly, I'm going to speak just for a moment, and I think this is maybe why Ree came to me, about Alzheimer's. My mother died of Alzheimer's, and that is one of the most horrible diseases for a family to deal with.
Couldn't agree with you more.
The process is so long and painful. And what I learned when I was going through it is that the rates of caregiver stress are so high. Mm-hmm. And there aren't a lot of resources for the caregivers out there. And I was looking at it when I was going through it and going, wow, if I don't get some help now, I could die before my mom. I saw the toll it took on my dad, on me. And it does absolutely cause depression in caregivers. There's no question about it. And this is not to say you shouldn't be angry with your dad, you know, but let me also mention two things. He probably didn't have it recognized by his healthcare providers or the people around him that he was more at risk than your mom in some ways because of the stress and the depression and the things that can set in when you're watching a loved one die by Alzheimer's and you're a primary caregiver. Secondly, and for all of you that may have anger at someone who died by suicide, and you have every right to be angry, but in that moment or in their decision-making process, what research tells us is that most of them don't believe that they're hurting you. They believe that they are such a burden to you that the world would be better off without them. And they're making that decision not out of hatred for you or a disregard for you. They're in their mind, even though it's an unhealthy thing, they really believe that they're doing their loved ones a favor by dying, because they don't want you to be burdened by them, because they really believe that they are a terrible burden, that they have nothing to contribute, and you would be better off to just grieve them and be over it. It's not accurate thinking, but know that that's what's going on in their minds. If that helps at all with the anger, they didn't do it to spite you or to hurt you. In most cases, it's not that. In most cases, it's they genuinely, in that darkness that they're struggling with, believe that you'd be better off without them. Does that make sense?
It makes sense. It makes sense.
Yeah, it's still okay to feel angry about it, but maybe it helps to know that most people don't do that to spite their loved ones.
I'm glad you brought that up, Jen, because we had a comment in the chat speaking to that very thing. And I think that needs to be said and heard, right? As a 12-year-old, my drug addicted mom threatened to suicide, then pretended to do it, and then said the only reason she didn't was because of me. So then I lived with the burden of bending to her every whim or she would kill herself. And she was a drug addict. So you might imagine how glorious my teenage years were. And I remember later being so angry with her and wishing she would have just done it for years. And then hating myself for feeling that way, right? And so all of those things because of that burden she had put on me. And of course, now that I know what I know as well that my grandpa felt that way. Not only because he verbalized it, but the world is not better without him. The world sucks without him.
Right.
But there was no getting him to see that at the time, right?
Yeah.
Do we have anyone else that has a question or anything to share while we have our lovely professionals here on the line? I'm going to go ahead and mute and just kind of scan our participant list here. Before I do, one other thing, Jen, I hate to put you on the spot, but I wanted, I know you already know, if you could also mention, Nell had mentioned in her compounding loss that she lost either one or both of her animals. And as we know, sometimes people minimize losing animals. Like, it's just and then fill in the blank. And again, I want to punch people in the face, but I don't, because I don't support violence. So if you could speak to that, because I know you're eloquent, I think people need to hear on that.
Yeah. Ree knows I'm passionate about that. I actually got my certification as a pet chaplain, and no, that's not a chaplain to the pet. It's a chaplain to the people who've lost pets. But because I understand the loss of a companion animal for people for whom those animals are lifelines, family members, it can be devastating. And Ree knows, I think the last time I had a chance to see her in person, I had just lost a companion animal to cancer and was literally just devastated. It was, and some people have a really hard time with this, but it was one of the hardest losses in my life. And I've lost both my parents and friends, but it was just a different relationship because this cat, I got her as a kitten when my mom was, when I was caregiving for my mom with Alzheimer's. This cat was my constant companion for 10 years. She went with me on trips. She was there with me through good times and bad. And sometimes that loss and especially the fact that like people are staying with the collective eye roll, it's just a pet and you can get another one, is mostly because they don't understand the incredible role that they can play in your support system for people, and that unconditional love. And I just personally believe for many of us, pets are a gift from God, a companion animal to give you a little taste of God's unconditional love for us. And so the loss of that can be significant, and all types of losses, not just death, cause you to have to grieve. And whether it's the loss of a job, a loss of a role in your life, you know, a loss of a friendship, or, you know, any of the other material losses, role losses, physical losses, all of those take a lot of energy and deplete our ability to really grieve effectively, so that we have to sort of spread that out over time.
Whew, I told y'all, she is just a gold mine. Wisdom, wisdom, wisdom. I don't see any more questions. I'm just going to check YouTube. I want to formally ask Ms. Jen Blazier if she has any kind of last comments to share. She's a mental health advocate warrior. So I'm going to give her a chance, since she didn't get to do our self-care tidbits, and then we'll be wrapping up in just a couple minutes.
Hi guys. Yes, unfortunately I didn't get to help out today and have fun with you all. I had was stuck at the clinic, and you know how fast they are. So my hour appointment turned into a 3-hour appointment. When it comes to suicide, I feel like it's one of those topics that I don't really open up and start a conversation on my own a lot of times, because I'm afraid of the audience and how they receive it. But when I talk to people, when they do open up about whether really it's any kind of loss, but with suicide, there tends to be that anger that was mentioned that tends to linger. I feel like we don't always give ourselves the same grace and compassion that we give to others. I know that I'm my hardest critic, you know, whether it's picking apart my body or the actions that I took, or yet I'd offer that compassion very quickly to somebody else. So I loved your advice, Ms. Ellers, on making sure that you're turning that inward and using that self-love and that self-care, resiliency, talking about it, crying about it. All of the things you're talking about are therapeutic and healing in their own different ways. My fur babies, man, when they pass, I'm going to be a hot mess too. So I totally feel how that's going to be. Sometimes I want to kick my kids out, but I'm like, no, my dogs can stay, right? Like, so I love all the advice. I love how open every single one of you have been with sharing your stories. It's hard and it's raw and it's real. And it hurts us in a place in our heart that's so deep that causes these pains to last for years. And like Jennifer Ellers said, like, you know, counseling is great. Counseling gets a bad rap. Like, I don't know why the whole world should be required to go to counseling. That's just how I feel. It's a resource and it's a tool. Use it. Don't be ashamed of it. I tell everybody we're in counseling all the time. My family counseling, individual counseling, so I don't kill my teenagers counseling, like all of it. And it's all helped in some way. And that can be through a chaplain, right? One of my most favorite family counselors that we've had was a pastor at our church. So there's different avenues. Sometimes just talking to a friend that's going to give you solid, sound advice and listen. Sometimes that's counseling, right? In its own little way. I mean, it's not official therapy, but it is, right? It's therapy. It fills my heart and my soul. So giving yourself a minute to understand that, like I saw several comments, grief isn't linear. You don't just, okay, I'm over it and I'm good. And that's not how it works. You have triggers and you have dates. Remind yourself that it's okay, that it's okay to not be okay sometimes, right? But my thought behind that comment is, but what are you doing about it? It's okay to not be okay, but it's not okay to stay there. using those tools and resources, all of those things are important. So reach out to your girlfriend, reach out to your counselor, give yourself a hug. All of it's deserving. And yes, there you go, Ree. It all has its own place, right? It's all beneficial in its own way. Thanks for letting me say a few things. I appreciate it, and I've really enjoyed listening to everybody. As hard as it is, thank you for sharing. Because although you shared something that might have been hard, it's impacted other people just by sharing your story. So thank you. So, thanks, Ree.
Thank you, ma'am. Absolutely. And I want to just parrot that with restating again that a lot of people, they avoid talking about suicide in general because of the stigma, right? That's why we do this. We want people to realize it's okay to talk about it. It's okay to cry on camera. I was crying. I didn't turn it off. I don't care. I'm human. It's sad. It's okay. It's okay. It's okay. It's okay. But more than that, it's life-giving more to me than it is sad, right? Like at the end of the day, I 100% believe that somewhere around the world, someone is going to hear Miss Hannah's testimony and they're going to go another day because she shared that. I absolutely believe it. And I think the proof is in the fact that someone else shared that. And Hannah is here with us today because she decided to go another day, right? And you don't have to attempt a suicide for it to affect you. I've seen people that have full plans written out. And when I learned that people do that, that blew my mind because I remember always believing that it was something you did in the heat of the moment or feeling like, oh, I can't take this anymore, right? Or whatever I thought suicide was until I lost my grandpa. And my world was completely opened. I want to also just not forget to formally thank not only everyone who has taken time out of their insanely busy lives to share with us, but also to listen in. All of our attendees, whether you're here live or whether you listen to the recording later. Thank you for taking the time, because what that means to me is it is an outward expression of your care for this topic and for your advocacy of this topic just by listening. And then I have full belief that you're going to do something with what you've heard over these last 2 days. Be it you learn how to be there for someone, or you change the way you talk about mental health, or whatever it may be. So I just want to, again, formally thank you. I'm going to go ahead and turn it back over to Jen. She has one more thing to share, and then I'm going to open the floor for about 5 seconds. So if you want to jump in after her, be ready. And then our very last speaker will be Dr. Cooper, who is going to completely close us out. So take it away, Ms. Jen.
Thank you. One thing I forgot to add that I feel is really important, and I feel like it's overlooked, is that if you ever unsure if someone's going to commit suicide, if you ever think that maybe that's an option, it is okay to ask them point blank out loud, do you have a plan? Are you going to commit suicide? Are those your thoughts? Sometimes them saying it out loud to another person means something. And it gives you the out of wondering if that's what they're going to do. Ask them point blank, are you planning on committing suicide? Say it out loud. It's okay to say out loud. So I just wanted to add that for anybody that might come across a relationship like that, it's okay to ask. So thank you, Ree, for letting me add that.
Absolutely. I'm so glad you did. It's so true. Jen, you look like you're ready to go.
I just wanted to reiterate what some people have said in regard to thanking the panelists for their stories. It was obvious that those weren't easy stories to tell because of the emotion that all of you had, and it takes phenomenal courage to speak about the things you spoke about. So thank you for that. I just want to echo what Ree said. It is going to make a difference. Every time you tell your story, lives are changed, and it makes a huge difference. And that means that the suffering you went through was not in vain. Good will come out of it. And thank you for taking the steps to speak out about it. I know it's not easy.
All right, any final thoughts from anyone else before we turn it over to Dr. Cooper? This has been a wonderful 2-day symposium. I am so proud of the work we've all done and all of the wisdom that we've shared. All of our presenters have made me better just by dumping a little more knowledge into my head, and made my heart a little bigger by sharing your stories. Made me feel human because I cried a little, because I spend so much energy trying not to cry because it's exhausting and makes your eyes puffy, right? Sometimes we need to just be human, and it's okay. So I don't see any more questions. Some folks have been ugly crying, and that is also okay. I'm going to go ahead then and turn it over to Dr. Cooper, if you would like to give us your closing remarks, and then I will post the link to the recording as soon as it is ready. And please share it away. Share it with anyone you feel needs or wants to hear it. Thank you all for coming.
All right, I'm going to share a few things from my heart as we wrap this up. I want to give a standing ovation, a round of applause for everyone who worked on the symposium this year. You've done a great job. Presenters are great, and everybody pulled it together, and it's been very successful. And I'm extremely honored to be the opening and closing person here. And I just wanted to share a few things from my heart. Every morning when I get up and every day when I come to the computer, I say a prayer, and I ask God to give me the wisdom of Solomon, give me that prayer that he has for wisdom, to have guidance and to know what to say and what to do. So I still think that that's a very powerful thing today, that we need to understand and ask for. Everybody's unique and what they need and what their needs are. We need to have good judgment in order to answer that. And I think about Winnie the Pooh, because Winnie the Pooh had some great wisdom, and he said, I thought about changing my mind, but I changed my shirt instead. So sometimes we just need a little change of environment. Sometimes we need to reach out to a friend and talk to someone else. I know on one of the last episodes of the Paul Newhart show, when he was a therapist, one of his clients, he told his client, says, I'm not going to see you anymore. And the client said, why is that? He said, you don't need to see me. You need a good friend. So I think, just like I had mentioned, the Beatles said, I get by with a little help from my friends. Sometimes we do have to reach out to our friends, and we have to look around. My sister always ends her prayers with, Lord, let us to be mindful of the needs of others. So sometimes there's people around us, maybe we're not reaching out for a friend, but maybe we need to reach out to them because they're the ones that need the friend. So what I want to do in closing is just mention that I want to talk for just a second about having good feelings and creating good feelings. Sometimes we get bogged by just watching the news on TV or listening to the radio and thinking it's all bad, but it's not all bad. We have to often focus on good feelings and good times and focus our minds on good things. And one of the things, and Hannah can tell you, we just finished with the Psychology Club 30 days of positive, uplifting music. And we asked our members to post songs and videos that they think about that have helped change their minds and change their lives, and to focus on positive things and trying to get negativity out of their minds and things, because we do have a lot of things to be grateful for, to be thankful for. And I always think about King David from the Old Testament, where he always went back to music. And we know he was a historical figure, whether a religious person or not. He had a lot of good wisdom. He went through some battles, but he also went through some triumphs. But he always he played on his harp, and he asked the musicians to come in. So we know that there's some healing and there's some soothingness from listening to different types of music and all. So what I'd like to close with is, when there are no words, maybe we can turn to music as something to help us, and turn to our friends. So get your hands together, because I got a song, and we're going to close on this song for you. It's a song that a friend of mine used to sing, and he taught me, and I just want to share it with you. I got a feeling everything's gonna be all right. I got a feeling that everything's gonna be all right. I got a feeling that everything's gonna be all right. Be all right now, be all right. Yes, be all right. Be all right.
Fantastic. Couldn't end better. You all have a wonderful, wonderful day.